There is one type of Space Marine force in Warhammer 40k that is more overlooked than any other. Not the shining loyalists or damnable traitor warbands, but the Renegade chapters. Space Marines cast out from the light of the Emperor of Mankind, yet defiant in the face of the Chaos Gods. Warriors who defy the Inquisition and the servants of the Warp alike. Chapters declared excommunicate traitoris and hunted across the stars. For all the madness that defines Warhammer 40k on a meta level, the contradictions, the retcons, the wild fan theories, the Renegade chapters are something most rare in Warhammer 40k. They're consistent. For all the lore rewrites and inconsistencies across decades of codices, campaign books, and Black Library novels, Renegade Space Marines seemingly have better homogenized characterization than Loyalist chapters or Chaos warbands. And whilst that might sound boring to some, I assure you it's not. Games Workshop's ability to be this level of consistent is so rare, especially when it comes to the Astartes, that Renegades become this exciting pearl of intrigue in Warhammer 40k. But before we get into the tier list, here's a little word from today's sponsor. For thousands of years, the Leagues of Votann have torn resource and riches from the most dangerous region in the galaxy, and now they have arrived in Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. This is Tacticus, the ultimate mobile turn-based tactical strategy game in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Build your squad from over 115 champions spanning 21 playable factions. Partake in PvP battles, PvE campaigns, guild raids, and more, all through nail-biting tactical skirmishes. In my playthroughs, I've realized the Leagues of Votann are one of, if not the most adaptable factions in the game. Their prioritized efficiency trait allows them to swap between mass offensive or defensive buffs at a moment's notice, making them tough to deal with in both PvE and PvP. The Tacticus developers have done a great job of making the Leagues of Votann's luck has, need keeps, toil earns feel like a part of their playstyle. It's no wonder Tacticus has won Best Updated Game and Best Community in the 2026 Pocket Gamer Awards. To celebrate the Leagues of Votann joining the roster, we're getting two back-to-back events. The Uthar the Destined Legendary event is coming March 8th, 2026, and in less than 2 weeks, a mixed Chaos vs Adeptus Sororitas event will be dropping on the 19th. There has never been a better time to jump into Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. Download now using my link in the description or by scanning the QR code on the screen now. Whether you're new or a seasoned Warhammer fan, there's plenty in Tacticus to dive into. And if you use our code ASTARTES10 before April the 8th, you can jumpstart your game with some rewards. Come and play Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus today. You see, in today's video, despite it being a tier list, one of the things you're going to take away from this is that Games Workshop's Renegade Space Marine chapters that have had print, mention, or publication over the years have for the most part been very consistent. Almost all of them, to varying degrees, actually follow the same guidelines with very little divergence, making the depiction of what Renegades are and are capable of more consistent than Loyalists or Chaos Space Marines. Right, let's first set some ground rules for the tier list. First things first, the chapters that are going to be listed here are going to be all of the chapters that have been officially recognized in 40k era novels and publications as Renegades, under the designation Renegade. However, there will be a few additions too. For example, some chapters that had elements go Renegade, but not the whole chapter will be included. And of course, all of the Badab secessionists will also be here. As for the time they were secessionists, they were Renegades. However, we will not be including Loyalist Space Marines turned Chaos Space Marine warbands unless they have a documented interim period as true Renegades. And as usual with these sorts of things, the list of chapters that have tiny one-off mentions in the lore is vast. However, I'm hoping that after we're done, an errant chapter that I may have missed will have its place in this list be obvious. Of course, it would be irresponsible of me to not have a set defined criterion in which to judge these chapters. Otherwise, this list has no real legitimacy, even as an opinion piece. So I spoke to some lore nerds, and I came up with 3 criterions which we're going to use to judge/rank these chapters based on how well they do in each. The first criterion is as follows. How effectively does this chapter contribute to and stay consistent with the setting's characterization of Renegade Space Marine chapters? Does their story make sense within the universe, or does it strain credibility? As we go through this list, you're going to get a really clear picture of the kind of things Renegade Space Marine chapters do and go through, and what their existence is like. This criterion is basically going to be our way of saying, does this chapter hold up against other Renegade chapters, or does this chapter even make sense? Our second criterion is, how compelling is their fall and fate on a scale of tragic and compelling to contrived? This criterion's really important to judge the believability of a chapter, fall and fate. A chapter's fall into disrepute could make sense, but conversely their actions and status afterwards could be wildly nonsensical. And inversely, a chapter could, in theory, have an utterly nonsensical fall, but could be really well characterized in the status quo of the universe. And our final criterion is, if this chapter is a part of any stories, narratives, or mentions, do they positively contribute to those stories, narratives, or mentions, or do they detract from them? This is really simple. If a Renegade chapter has been used in a Black Library novel or novels, is their inclusion and characterization a boon or a blow for that novel? Similarly, lots of chapters, not just Renegades, are never mentioned in novels and only appear in indexes and codices. So this criterion will also try to take a wider view at Renegade chapters that haven't made it into novels, but are alternatively explored through other texts. And just before we get into the list, we are going to start with D tier, work our way to the top, then end with the very worst, followed by the very best. D tier. D tier is really kind of funny. You know how I opened the video saying that Games Workshop has, generally speaking, done a really good job of the characterization of Renegade chapters? Well, this is even true in D tier. You see, the worst thing you can accuse any of these chapters of is a lack of information or appearances. So we're going to put them all on the list right now. The Thunder Barons, the Star Gorgons, the Imperial Paladins, and the Crimson Castellans. These all make it into D tier for having one thing in common, that they all lack any real information. All we know of the Thunder Barons is they are mentioned in the Soul Drinkers Omnibus and Legion of the Damned 2012 as eventually falling to Khorne. All we know about the Star Gorgons is that according to the Black Templars 9th edition Codex, they got pushed in by the Black Templars after they turned Renegade. All we know about the Imperial Paladins is that their 4th company were corrupted by Xenos near the opening of M41 and were one of the chapters mentioned in Imperial Armor Volume 10 to build hype for the Minotaurs chapter, who, as you might have guessed, killed the Renegade Imperial Paladins. And all we know about the Renegade Crimson Castellans comes from the 5th edition Tyranids Codex, which tells us that the chapter was busy fighting its Renegade elements when the Tyranids rocked up to flatten a hive world they were on. This is really it for these, and as I mentioned a moment ago, I still think these haven't been characterized poorly as much as they just haven't really been characterized at all. One of the things you realize when you spend your life combing through 40k lore is that if something interesting has very little lore, be it only a few lines or paragraphs, it's good to be grateful, because historically, Games Workshop has had a habit of giving certain things really inane, nonsensical lore, as opposed to leaving things to be background mysteries. Out of the 4, I'd probably say the Imperial Paladins are the best here. Anything included in that era of Imperial armor books is automatically gold as far as I'm concerned. And someone had to get name-checked to help hype up the Minotaurs as Renegade killers. Also, possessed by Xenos during the Macarian Heresy, that's pretty cool, I think, even if it is summed up in 1 or 2 throwaway sentences. C tier. Opening up with C tier, we've got the Tiger Claws. Man, I really wanted to put the Tiger Claws a little higher up on this list. I love that the chapter was around in the 1st edition of Warhammer 40k in that original book, and I really love their color scheme. I mean, look how menacing this is. But their lore, it's just not the one. It's not bad. None of it is bad. It's just, for the purpose of analyzing them as renegades with our 3 criterions, they essentially just operate as an extension of the Astral Claws, a much more interesting and fleshed out renegade chapter which, as you might have guessed, are going to be much higher up on this list. They definitely don't belong in D tier as they do have a fair bit of lore, with almost all of it being contained in Imperial Armor Volume 9, Badab War Part 1. To make a long story short, the chapter went missing in the warp at an indeterminable time before the current era. All of their history and campaigns, etc. was lost with them. In fact, the only thing that remained was that they were the only known successor of the Astral Claws chapter. After they popped out of the warp in mid-M41, they got their cheeks clapped by the Eldar, barely survived, went home to their fortress monastery to find that their homeworld had been given galactic chemotherapy and was now uninhabitable as their solar system's sun had expanded. The crippled remnants of the chapter went to Terra and basically asked for new gene stocks they could rebuild, but for one reason or another, they didn't wait for Terra to give them a response, upping and vanishing from all records. Now, normally, this is something that the Imperium gets pretty spicy about. However, the Inquisition decides it's no problem as A, they're at death's door anyway, and B, they reveal that they might even be a cursed founding chapter, so good riddance, ostensibly. It's discovered during the Badab War that the Tiger Claws didn't wait to find out what Terra thought of bringing them back, and instead hightailed it to their parent chapter, the Astral Claws, where Luft Huron, the tyrant of Badab, basically said, "Welcome home," and proceeded to use the Tiger Claws as a new wave of Astral Claws in his upcoming civil war, hence turning the Tiger Claws into Renegades. I think if Games Workshop were to do a short exploration of some narrative surrounding the Cursed Founding chapters, it would be really cool to see the Tiger Claws and their disappearance expanded upon. Anyways, yeah, definitely C tier for the Tiger Claws. The Venom Claws are next, and they're fun, but their lore's a little limited. All from one short story, Erixia 2019 by Ben Counter, the guy responsible for the Soul Drinkers Omnibus and a bunch of other stories in 40k, including the story of the Mechanicus game. The Venom Thorns are a successor chapter of the Imperial Fists, and they're kind of an answer to the question, what would happen if an Imperial Fist successor chapter started an empire building? You see, this chapter, the Venom Thorns, or at least an indeterminable portion of the Venom Thorns, started to feel entitled to the planets they had saved over their career, and eventually one planet, the world of Xanatar, they decided to take for themselves. It was meant to be the beginning of their own yellow Ultramar. Well, the Imperial Fists themselves heard about this and decided Space Marine empire building was for bureaucrats and pussies, so they sent a man. One man! Reclusiarch Belisar. Belisar actually made himself 100 bolt rounds to solve this problem. The actual events of how exactly Belisar solved the problem are really vague, but we do know that he was successful. The Imperial Fists even raised a statue of him on the Phalanx, and the Venom Thorn's fate was left unknown. But what we do know is thanks to Belisar, their hold over Xanatar came to an end. I think we have to do a little inference here. 100 bolt rounds could be symbolic. After all, there are 100 Marines in a company, so it could be that the chapter wasn't entirely Renegade, maybe it was just one company, which is something that you'll see more than once in this video. How exactly one Reclusiarch put down a company, though, is another question entirely. And no, I don't have an answer for that. I don't think anyone does. That said, I like this depiction of the Venom Thorns. It's short and sweet. And what few Renegade elements it uses are classics. The idea of Space Marines feeling entitled to deeds, lands, and ownership for their service. It's a common and great trope amongst Renegades, mirrored at least in part by Badab. Similarly, this is also a great example of how Space Marines and the Imperium look upon Space Marine chapters who are determined to build their own empires. Again, mirrored by Badab. The truth is, Space Marine empire building is one thing the Imperium of Man cannot stand. It makes everyone uneasy. The old empires within the Imperium, like Ultramar for example, get to exist as their existence is essential to the running of the Imperium. But new empires, with Astartes at their head? Instant inquisitorial sanction. Or in the Venom Thorns case, a Big Daddy chaplain from the Imperial Fist says sit down and stop being cringe. It's a really great standard to set in terms of what Space Marines can and can't do. The Sons of Pertinax. I really like the Sons of Pertinax. Much like the Venom Thorns, their lore is short and sweet, all coming from 2004's White Dwarf 297. As the only, at least as far as we know, canon chapter named of the 17th founding, the original name of the Sons of Pertinax has been lost. Their new name, the Sons of Pertinax, is in honor of the man who led the chapter back into the light of the Imperium. You see, they're a suspected Imperial Fist successor chapter, and much like the Venom Thorns, they also decided they were entitled to their own empire. In M41, their chapter master, Commodus, desired to subjugate and enslave worlds for himself. When he began this, the Inquisition immediately excommunicated the chapter, declaring them traitors. The Inquisition and the Order of Astartes has a pretty consistent playbook when it comes to chapter masters they don't like. Often the Inquisition has enough foresight to know when a chapter isn't going to be a problem, just its leadership. As was the case with the Sons of Pertinax, who were, by all accounts, perfectly Codex compliant. So the Inquisition sent an assassin. Like I said, this is a consistent playbook for the Inquisition, as they did the same thing, or at least tried to, with Gabriel Seth, the chapter master of the Flesh Tearers. This took place in 2017's assassination of Gabriel Seth. However, unlike the Flesh Tearer chapter master, Commodus wasn't able to defeat the assassin and was killed. Also, yes, I know this opens up some problems for the Flesh Tearers. They've not been declared renegades. At least, not yet. But the Inquisition wants their chapter master dead, so they may try again. Or we may live to see a narrative where the Flesh Tearers actually do become renegades. In the wake of Commodus's death, Pertinax took control of the chapter, and it was renamed in his honor. And then they undertook a penitent crusade. Again, I think this is generally really great characterization for a renegade chapter. Short, sweet, reinforcing the same in-lore guidelines that empire building is always punished. But another comparison to Badab as well, in the form of the Sons of Pertinax being sent on a penitent crusade for failing to stop their own chapter master's ambition. The Graven Spectres. Mooch and I got out a joke when we were doing this part of the script, kept calling them the Graven Spectres, because we just kept saying it quickly. Graven Spectres, Grave-in Spectres. The Graven Spectres. They're a weird one, and there's really only one reason I've put them in C tier instead of D tier, but I'll get to that in just a sec. The reason they're so weird is because when we hear about them for the first and only time in the Grey Knight 7th Ed Codex, they're already renegades. Running for their lives, as a matter of fact. It's about 300 years into M41, and they're haphazardly plundering a relic world known as Siban. And on Siban is something known as a Great Stasis Museum. I tried to find other examples of stasis museums in 40k, but outside of Necron shenanigans, I couldn't find anything. So we're just gonna have to use our imagination to work out what an Imperial stasis museum is. Anyways, as the Renegade Graven Spectres are payday 2ing their way through the Stasis Museum, they idiotically manage to release a demon prince called Noir. Noir spelt K-O-N-R. Noir starts using the relics inside this museum and begins folding the Graven Spectres into pretzels, all whilst flooding Siban with hordes of demons. It's not an understatement to say that Noir, with all his artifacts and demon hordes, was not small fry. Sometime into this extremely one-sided massacre, a single squad of Grey Knights showed up. A single squad of Grey Knights was simply not going to be enough. The 7th Ed Grey Knights Codex talks about how the Grey Knights fought their way over the mounds of Graven Spectre bodies in an attempt to quell the demon uprising. The squad is able to make it to the Stasis Museum, but realize they're basically kind of screwed, and that they have no hope of winning. So they Deus Ex the Stasis Museum, causing a massive meltdown resulting in a stasis field engulfing the entire planet, temporally freezing everything on the world, including the Grey Knights themselves. Theoretically, one could travel to Siban in the current era, and assuming they had a way to be unaffected by the stasis field, they'd still be able to find the warm bodies of the Graven Spectres on the ground. Now you're probably wondering, what's the thing that's got me putting them in C tier instead of D tier? Well, to be honest, there is one thing the Graven Spectres do really well, and that's carrying the greatest, most consistent theme and motif that Renegades have. Tragedy. Doomed to fail. Every single Renegade chapter is defined by this. Tragedy. 40k is often tragedy and suffering made manifest, but Renegades take it one step further. We'll see more examples of this throughout the video, but the truth is, Renegades will have one of 3 destinies. Death, corruption, or penitence. There is one, and only one exception in all of canon to this, and we'll get to them later. Anyways, Graven Spectres, C tier. You'll be remembered fondly as corpse shields for the Grey Knights. B tier. We can now get into the real meat and potatoes of the list. I'm in love with all of these Renegade chapters. They are great. In fact, if you are homebrewing Renegade Space Marines, I would suggest you look at all of the ones in this part of the list for inspiration before anything else. Why this and not A tier? Well, A tier is a little bit skewed, and you'll see why when we get there. These chapters generally have way more depth and lore than the previous ones, so what we're going to do is, as we go through them, and as I finish talking about them, I'm going to refer back to our 3 criterions, to see if we can measure how good they are and what ways they excel. The Knights of the Blood. I know many guys whom of which this is their favourite Renegade chapter, and with bloody good reason. In fact, to be entirely honest with you, this is one of my favourite Renegade Space Marine chapters too. They are the definitive Renegade Blood Angels, savage yet scholarly, arrogant yet self-sacrificing. Once upon a time, the Knights of the Blood were the best of both the Blood Angels and the Flesh Tearers combined. From Devastation of Baal 2017, we learned that the first ever chapter master of the Knights of Blood, a man named Austin Galile, was a true and rare scholar amongst Space Marines. He bore a genuine fondness for history, and his chapters librarious. Galile is personally responsible for much of the written recorded history of Baal and its people. And when his chapter was excommunicated thousands of years after his death, his ancient texts guaranteed his renegade brothers would remain noble and loyal to Baal. Unfortunately for the Knights of Blood, they had a problem. a problem shared with their brother chapter, the Flesh Tearers, except far, far worse. Like the Flesh Tearers, the Knights were capable of unimaginable feats of savagery and hyper-violence, even by Astartes standards. And with it came one of, if not the worst vulnerabilities to the Black Rage in any Astartes chapter ever. In their desperation, they sought a release from this, a means of lessening the Black Rage in their brothers, and they found a release. The ravenous consumption of fresh human blood on a scale unheard of. Uncontrolled and unrestricted, the Knights of Blood drank humans in droves. The overconsumption of blood to stave off the Black Rage is not without precedent in Warhammer 40k. You see, we learn from the short story Eminence Sanguis 2017 that the Angels Vermilion chapter, a second founding Blood Angel successor, have a similar practice to the Knights of Blood. Every 50 years, the Angels Vermilion will bring all available brothers back to their homeworld, who will then partake in a ritual involving the slaughter and bloodletting of masses of loyal servants to the chapter. The blood is drained into a Goliath bath from which the brothers drink and bathe. The Angels Vermilion themselves suffer no extenuating affliction from the Black Rage. I mean, they are still affected by it, but it is lessened so greatly, or at least they claim it is. Because of this ritual, the Angels Vermilion boast one of, if not the strongest resiliences to the Black Rage of any of the sons of Sanguinius. However, when the Angels Vermilion were discovered taking rescued Imperial citizens from other worlds for this ritual, the Blood Angels chapter disavowed them as brothers. Dante was thoroughly unimpressed when several companies of Angels Vermilion arrived during the devastation of Baal. The blood drinking of the Knights of Blood had no such controlled, once every 5 decades ritual like the Angels Vermilion. They drank the innocent fervorously, without pause or halting. We find out in the Deathwatch RPG rulebook Rites of Battle that the excesses the Knights of Blood began to commit would see them declared traitor by not just the Ordo Astartes, but by the High Lords themselves. It wasn't long for the Knights of Blood's inordinate consumption, as well as their banishment from the Emperor's light, to bring forth a new mutation, chapter-wide. Their skin became crimson red, their eyes yellow, and their teeth monstrous and beastly. They ultimately resembled lesser versions of the vampire beast Astartes held within the Tower of Amareo and Baal. Or, potentially, bloodletters. For 100 years or so, the chapter would migrate silently across the Imperium, taking losses like all renegades do. Rumors from the Deathwatch persisted of them spending a number of years in the Jericho Reach. However, the time would come for the Knights of Baal to one day come home. Centaur Jewel, the chapter master of the Knights, would tell Dante of visions he in his chapter 4 saw of a great threat to Baal. And so he and his brothers came, alongside the great reassembling of Blood Angel successor chapters to fight off the Tyranids of Baal. For one final battle, the Knights of Blood weren't just loyal Imperial warriors, they were with the Blood Angels Legion again. The great demon Kabunda, the old enemy of the Primarch Sanguinius, would attempt to bring the Knights of Blood into Khorne's thrall. But the Knights, despite being mutated, bloodthirsting vampiric monsters, would reject Khorne wholesale. The Knights of Blood remained sane and human to the very last, opting to stay behind to stall the enemy as the Blood Angel successors made their escape. I'm not going to explain why I adore this chapter in more detail. I think their tragedy, heroism, and sacrifice speaks for itself. We will, however, take a quick look at our criterion. Does their story make sense within the universe, or does it strain credibility? I'd say it absolutely makes sense in the universe. They're never bigged up or made to feel all-powerful. They're always characterized as on the run and weakening, and ultimately faithful to their own history, and context within the wider lore of the Blood Angels, like their connection to the Flesh Tearers and the Angels Vermilion. How compelling is their fall and fate on a scale of tragic and compelling to contrived? I'd say very compelling. The only thing that I think is a little on the latter end of the scale is how they managed to evade the Imperium for the best part of 100 years. But I wouldn't say that's completely outside of the realm of plausibility. I think they knew they were dying. I think to a degree they were grateful for a chance to regain their honor in death at Baal. And finally, if this chapter is a part of any stories, narratives, or mentions, do they positively contribute to those stories, narratives, or mentions, or do they detract from them? I think they very much made the devastation of Baal a more enjoyable tale. It's fun. Not only does accepting them with open arms show how desperate Dante was, but it's actually quite entertaining seeing them compared to the Angels Vermilion at Baal, and how Dante would rather have honorable renegades at his side than dishonorable loyalists. The Crimson Sabers. The Crimson Sabers are one of the more opaque exemplifications of tragedy among the Renegade Space Marine chapters. However, they did not remain renegades for very long. Few Space Marines since the days of the Legions have ever been so susceptible to the corrupting ravages of chaos like the Crimson Sabers. So, I have to ask you a question. Have you ever heard of the Crimson Slaughter? You probably have. And if you haven't, the Crimson Slaughter have been an extremely prevalent Chaos warband for a very long time. Sadly, their prominence has been curtailed since the renaissance of 40k and the introduction of Primaris, but it wasn't that long ago that the Crimson Slaughter had unique models, a character model, and even a whole codex supplement in 6th edition. I bring this up because the Crimson Slaughter is what became of the Crimson Sabers. You see, according to that codex supplement, the Crimson Sabers were created around or before M36, with no recorded founding or progenitor. Around that time, they took part in something known as the Amalgamation Schism, a war waged by the Imperium of Man against a singularly gargantuan space hulk that had breached real space. The Inquisition, Blood Angels, Dark Angels, and Crimson Sabers were all heavily invested in this war. In that codex supplement, it said that it's tradition for first founding chapters to take the lead in conflicts like this, although I'd argue this is contested in a lot of other material. And the Crimson Sabers found themselves at odds with both the Dark Angels and the Blood Angels for choosing to operate independently of those two ancient chapters. This quickly created a rift between the chapters, a rift formed under the ever-scrutinous eyes of the Inquisition. Ultimately though, the Crimson Sabers did not rebuke the methods or tactical operandi of the two out of malice, but a well-intentioned, if foolhardy, desire to prove themselves. Though this proving was challenged by the Dark Angels, specifically a Dark Angels chaplain, and if you know anything about Dark Angels chaplains, you know they are made out of ruthless stuff. It wasn't long between a small battle ensued between squads of the Sons of the Lion and the Crimson Sabers. In the end, both chapters took losses. The Dark Angels were preparing to fully eradicate the Crimson Sabers, but the Inquisition stepped in, stopping the Dark Angels, and ensuring that the Crimson Sabers would face a more formal repercussion. In the time that followed the Amalgamation Schism, the Crimson Sabers would receive an official statement of censure from Terra herself. Censure that was supported not just by the suspicious Inquisition and the begrudged Dark Angels, but also by the noble Blood Angels too. And it was in this act that we would learn why the chapter's lineage is unknown. As in response to this dishonor, the chapter master at the time, Nigelus, would formally sever all bonds of fellowship his chapter had with the wider Adeptus Astartes, including all records of their forebears. He would die an ignominious death around 100 years later, but not before radically altering his chapter's creed into something that prized ruthlessness above all else. Entering M37, the chapter would partake in numerous Space Marine crusades of the era, but would find themselves slowly succumbing to paranoia, as they never quite shook off the resentment thrust upon them by the Dark Angels and the Blood Angels, believing every ally they fought alongside was growing ever more suspicious of them. To make matters worse, during the same period whilst the chapter was away on crusade, their homeworld of Rogan would be razed to ash under a demonic incursion. Thus, the Crimson Sabers bore witness to the exterminatus of their own homeworld and a number of surrounding worlds under their ward. The chapter's pride would, as you might suspect, be irreparably damaged. Over the next 1,000 years, the chapter's paranoia and mistrust and resentment would fester into something far worse, something tangible, something primed for corruption. A corruption that would begin to rear its head in the jungle world of Umidia in early M41. The Crimson Sabers came to respond to distress signals on the planet, coming down to settlements to find corruption and the taint of chaos, purging it only to hear more distress calls on the world, spreading out finding no one worth saving, just more corruption. Every time they arrived, they were too late. Millions of people corrupted. Chaos could corrupt rapidly, make no mistake, but this was something else. Statistically, with such fresh distress signals, it should have been impossible for everyone to be corrupted. It wasn't long before any notion of rescue was removed from the chapter's mission objectives. Instead, such notions were replaced with methodical genocide. Everyone on the world would die, and not from orbit either. The chapter was mobilized, making planetfall, going through every colony, every settlement, and every building, every room, expending bolt shell after bolt shell in an effort to deliver genocide. The Inquisition was not ignorant of Umidia's need for a savior, and so when the Crimson Sabers reported their deeds to the Inquisition, they were shocked and appalled. However, The Ordo Astartes of the Inquisition does not act without good cause. Thus, the Ordo Hereticus mobilized inquisitors and teams to examine Numidia, and the events that took place on its surface, and they all came to one clear conclusion. The spread of chaos that the Crimson Sabres had reported was largely false, and the violence they had unleashed upon the people of Numidia was nothing less than a planetary act of butchery against the Imperial citizenry. As the Inquisition and the Imperium at large was deciding what should be done with the chapter, they began to suffer strange, ominous symptoms, racing hearts, oppressive dread, and an inability to meditate. Haunted by the faces of those they had slain on Numidia, whispers filled their minds, growing louder and louder each day. Chapter Master Sevastus Cranon, seeking answers and vindication, redirected the fleet to Demetra, Numidia's neighboring world, hoping to find further corruption to root out and proving some kind of innocence. But by the time they made planetfall, their madness had deepened. The Sabres descended not as warriors, but as deranged killers, slaughtering Demetra's populace in another mindless purge. To their grim astonishment, the haunting voices they were experiencing ceased, silenced by the bloodshed. It was in the wake of this that the Crimson Sabres would be declared excommunicate traitores and be officially branded as renegade space marines. The Ordo Astartes and Ordo Hereticus made an Imperium-wide alert, the kind typical when a renegade chapter is born, naming them and demanding they be fought and killed on sight. Chapter Master Cranon was met with fear. What could he do? His brothers were afflicted with a condition, a disease of the mind. They needed help and grace, not the business end of a bolter. He and his brothers were, loyal to the Imperium of Man, but what could he do? His chapter's madness only deepened. Only excessive violence would free their minds from their insanity. So he devised a plan. A plan to find a sense of nobility and ultimately closure for his brothers. The Crimson Sabres would make for the Eye of Terror. It was Sevastus Cranon's belief that this journey would kill him and his brothers, that the Imperium of Man would see and thwart their trip, and in doing so give his brothers the battle required to end their madness and their lives. However, against all odds, the tactical brilliance of Cranon and the unyielding nature of the Crimson Sabres would see them all the way to the Eye. Despite heinous losses and a protracted void war with a blockade of Imperial Fist cruisers who would be designated as the Sabres' final executioners, the remains of the chapter actually made it into the Eye. However, the Eye of Terror is no place for renegade space marines, especially those whose minds have already been touched by madness. You see, the Crimson Sabres would be seen once more in the current setting, re-emerged as the Crimson Slaughter. The great tactician, Cranon, would go on to become one of the most powerful Chaos Lords the Imperium has ever seen, his forces fighting the Imperium at every conceivable turn. He made deals with Fabius Bile, aided Abaddon the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade, slew an Imperial Saint, and even had his chapter's long-awaited and violent reunion with the Dark Angels, killing the 5th Company captain of the Sons of the Lion. There is far more to this chapter/warband than I've talked about, but I've realized I'm dragging on a bit, and I have covered the real renegade bits of the chapter anyway. The Crimson Sabres/Crimson Slaughter are genuinely one of the coolest, most interesting, and well-fleshed-out sub-factions of Space Marines in the setting, inasmuch as almost every aspect of their arc has been covered in some way, and blissfully, mostly narratively. I've just realized I was sparse on sources for the previous bit, so just for context, we've got the Dark Vengeance novella, the Crimson Dawn novella, the aforementioned supplement, and the Black Crusade Traitor's Hate book, as well as the Fall of Cadia novel. They have such a great history, and whilst their time as renegades is very short-lived, I still think they're a solid B tier. And let's have a quick look at our criterions again as to why. Does their story make sense within the universe, or does it strain credibility? Well, it definitely makes sense. We get the Inquisition getting solid and consistent characterization when it comes to Astartes getting funky. We also see that they're basically dying as they're trying to flee. And of course, it follows one of the 3 final fates for Renegade chapters: death, corruption, or penance. In this case, corruption. After all, if you are to survive, and the Imperium will not help you, who can you turn to if not the Dark Gods? How compelling is their fall and fate on a scale of tragic and compelling to contrived? I think they're super compelling. And undeniably tragic. Space Marines whose origins are optimistic, if not a little arrogant, falling to paranoia, distrust, and eventual madness. And who could possibly argue with having a recurring grudge with the Dark Angels, and actually being a match for them at that? I think the only thing that's a little bit contrived about them is that they managed to bypass the Imperial Fist's blockade, but it was at great cost, so I think we can safely doubt this idea that they've just got plot armor. And finally, if this chapter is a part of any stories, narratives, or mentions, do they positively contribute to those stories, narratives, or mentions, or do they detract from them? This is fun, because the Crimson Sabers and the Crimson Slaughter contribute to so many narratives. So many big ones, too. I literally can't imagine how any of the stories they've been a part of would be better off without them. And big up Games Workshop in Sickhead for realizing a non-core faction needed its own supplement. Let's work on bringing them back for 11th, yeah? So, a much shorter one this time, the Flame Falcons. Now, I really almost put the Flame Falcons in C tier, and to be honest, I'm still a little on the fence about it. Conquest 75, a Warhammer 40k magazine from the Conquest magazine's line, tells us that the Flame Falcons worked alongside the Iron Hands, Genesis chapter, Death Strike chapter to exterminatus a number of worlds to create a firebreak, halting the advancement of High Fleet Leviathan, which is really confusing because the Flame Falcons were born of the Cursed Founding and were declared renegades and wiped out within a century of their creation, approximately 5,000 years before the first Tyranid invasion. Basically, according to the 2nd edition Codex Ultramarines, the Flame Falcons started to show a very unique defect. When in combat, they would burst into flames. Flames that, fortunately, would leave them entirely unharmed. Unfortunately for the Flame Falcons, however, is that the Imperium condemns you for how you look, and not how loyal you are. Take a look at the many kinds of totally loyal abhumans throughout the Imperium of Man. We did a whole video on this topic a while back. The Imperium's prejudice towards anything that doesn't fit into the purview of genetically pure is immense. There are very few exceptions to this, like Ogrins for example, and even then they're bred for cannon fodder and servitorization. The warriors of the Adeptus Astartes are little different. All chapters that look off are just one bad day away from summary execution. Like the Black Dragons and their bone protrusions for example. There is an entire short story about an Inquisitor sending Space Marines to infiltrate the Black Dragons just to condemn them. 2003's White Dwarf 279, the Death of Antagonist novel, as well as the short story Bless the Curse, all tell us that the Inquisition is pretty much ready to put down the Black Dragons at a moment's notice. Which brings us back to the Flame Falcons. Once the Inquisition heard of their flames, they were declared renegade, and the Grey Knights were dispatched to put the chapter down, which they did. I think the reason I've put this chapter into B tier instead of C or D is because despite how little info we have on the chapter and the somewhat contradictory nature of their conflict with the Tyranids, they are still a brilliant example of how deeply ingrained the Imperium's prejudice is. The Empire of Man in the 41st millennium lives and dies by its bigotry, a bigotry that even its superhuman angels are not spared from. Also, side tangent, if you're homebrewing an Inquisitor and Retinue at the moment, is a cool bit of info. From the Virago Fastness short story from 2017, we learned that Lord Inquisitor Otto Dagova of the Ordo Xenos has a Black Shield Space Marine in his retinue. And we learned during that short story that said Black Shield was once a Flame Falcon. Likely the last Flame Falcon. I really like this because it's in line with how Ordo Xenos Inquisitors, as opposed to Malleus or Hereticus, are more likely to be radical as opposed to Puritan Inquisitors. And as such, he's essentially got in his employ a lone Space Marine from an excommunicated chapter who would, in all likelihood, be dead without him. To close off, I did find a source. Sorry, not really a source, but I found on the Lexicanum it said there have been sightings of immolated Marines on more than one occasion on the battlefield, but in good Lexicanum fashion, it fails to provide any actual source on this information, so if we assume this is true, and we assume there's a source for it, it feels like it could apply to a bunch of different things, so I am going to go ahead and discard this. A funny time to mention, but some lore tubers, not going to name any names, like to big up the Lexicanum for lore. And whilst the Lexicanum is definitely better than the other wiki, do take everything you read on there with a pinch of salt. Read the source material yourself if you actually have a vested interest in any particular bit of lore or faction, and aren't just looking for the broad and occasionally inaccurate overview. So, criterions. Does their story make sense within the universe, or does it strain credibility? I think most of it makes sense. Timeline is a bit scuffed though. But if we subscribe to the notion that they're somehow still alive, yeah, it probably does strain credibility. I'm not gonna entertain the fan theory that they're somehow connected with the Legion of the Damned. That comes from a source which has largely been retconned, so I'm not sure how I feel about it. And besides, as far as fan theories go, the Legion of the Damned being like Imperial demon souls of the Legion slain at Istvand is way cooler in my opinion, but that's just me. How compelling is their fall and fate on a scale of tragic and compelling to contrived? See, this and the next criterion are the bits that make me wonder if I should lower them a tier. They don't really have a lot to go on in terms of emotional engagement that a reader could draw from their texts. And finally, if this chapter is a part of any stories, narratives, or mentions, do they positively contribute to those stories, narratives, or mentions, or do they detract from them? Similarly, I wouldn't say anything therein is made worse by their addition, but it's hard to say that it's made better. Although I will give them props for contributing to that consistent characterization of how the Imperium responds to renegades. About how the Imperium responds to renegades, aka kill on sight. Right, next up we have the Avenging Sun's Third Company. Before we get into this, I want to say that this entry and the next one do a great job of telling us that renegades do not need to be a whole chapter. Renegade Space Marines are, by definition, Space Marines unaffiliated with the Imperium and Chaos. Of course, in universe, all Chaos Space Marines are technically renegades, but in the context of defining the three types of Space Marine force/group, there are Loyalist chapters, Renegade chapters/warbands, and Chaos warbands. When we get to our The Worst entry, just try to remember this. Renegades are renegades because they are Space Marines affiliated with neither Imperium or Chaos. Anyways, the Avenging Suns chapter are a great chapter with actually a fair bit of lore in 40k. Not as much as the Knights of Blood or the Crimson Sabres, but certainly more than the Flame Falcons. You see, we learn in the novel, Belisarius Call, The Great Work 2019, that the Avenging Suns are one of the 10 shield chapters of Ultramar assigned by the Primarch Rabute Guilliman. Said chapter's role is to permanently and exclusively defend the realm of Ultramar. Between them, they comprise a miniature legion of 10,000 Space Marines. And whilst at the time of writing this, I don't know if it'll be true, I think it's highly likely that the Avenging Suns chapter will have some role to play in the newly reminted Captain Titus's reclamation of the 500 worlds. So, who are the Avenging Suns' Third Company and why are they on this list? Well, in 970 M41, so not that long ago in the grand scheme of things, the entire Third Company of this exemplary chapter went renegade. In the short story Renegades 2009 by Gav Thorpe, we find that the company has been sent to the world of Archimedon to defend an important spaceport from Chaos. For reasons that aren't wholly clear, the librarian Zacharias, who was assigned to the Third Company, had a vision. I don't know what he foresaw, but with his vision he convinced the company's captain, a man named Gassart, to destroy the port rather than protect it. Now, I'm not gonna lie, the chapter and the company got off very easy from this traitorous course of action. Probably because they are, and always have been, one of the most exemplary successors of the Ultramarines. So as punishment, the Third Company was demanded to undertake something called a penance patrol, which is basically a mini penitent crusade. Meant less to punish through suffering and more to just kinda shame them. Anyways, during this patrol, the company was called to assist a planet suffering from a chaos uprising. But by the time they had arrived, pretty much the entire planet had fallen to chaos. Quote, over 75% of the planet's population had succumbed to a chaos cult. The Space Marines went down to purge this 75%. Now, you might be drawing some comparison here to the Crimson Sabres, which is entirely fair. However, the Crimson Sabres mobilized a whole chapter and committed genocide on a jungle planet against a largely defenseless population. The Third Company was just a single company against a planet full of well-organized and well-armed mortal warriors. In just over a month, the company, 100 Marines strong, had been reduced to only about 30 Marines, and the cultist armies were actively trying to open a warp rift above the world. It was kinda hopeless, make no mistake. At this point, the remaining Marines had absolutely no chance of victory. The one living chaplain in the group, a brother named Hadain, basically declared that it was the company's duty to sacrifice themselves here, on this world, even though no good would come of it. Therefore, the aforementioned Captain Gassart decided, screw the Imperium, screw this planet, and screw these cultists, and most of all, screw this chaplain. Gassart then proceeded to fold the chaplain into a pretzel, killing him before taking his remaining men and deciding that their lives were far more important than whatever the hell the chaplain was suggesting. So he took his brothers, abandoned their penance patrol, and left the planet to its inevitable fate. Now self-declared renegades, the company took their strike cruiser and managed to flee just before the warp rift opened. Fortunately, as only 30 Marines and a strike cruiser, it was a lot more practical for the Renegade company to maneuver mostly unnoticed throughout the Imperium than it would have been for a Renegade chapter fleet with whole battle barges like what the Crimson Sabres had. As detailed in the short story The Rewards of Tolerance 2011, over the coming months and years, the company removed their heraldry and made for the Eye of Terror, as no Renegade can really survive in Imperial space for all that long. It's unclear if they all knew where they were going or what they were doing, but what is clear is that because of their minimal resources, as is normal with Renegades, they had to resort to using the Librarian, Zacharis, as a navigator. This unfortunately left the Librarian vulnerable to corruption, and with no fellow Librarians or Chaplains left, there wasn't really anyone to halt this corruption. As such, the Librarian was eventually possessed. The company went on to raid Imperial merchant ships on their journey to the Eye, and in a funny turn of events, whilst they were raiding a convoy of merchants for supplies, some Eldar showed up to basically ransack the ship of the mortal bodies manning them. The company and the Eldar had a brief exchange of fire until they both caught wind of an Imperial Navy fleet showing up. Knowing neither would survive the Imperial Navy, they made a truce. The Space Marines would willingly hand over all the mortals to act as slaves for the Eldar, and in exchange, the Eldar would allow the Space Marines to make off with all the valuable resources the merchants had. However, being the absolute cheeky bastards they were, as both ships were leaving the system, the company fired a shot at the Eldar's ship, crippling it, before jumping into the warp themselves, leaving their Eldar allies to be destroyed by the Navy. The final time the company would be seen was many years later, near the Cadian Gate at approximately 997.M41, by which time the company had completely fallen to chaos. Right, our criterions. Does this story make sense within the universe, or does it strain credibility? I think they're generally very believable. Nothing really jumps out at me as difficult to comprehend or stretching what's possible. Once more, we get this wonderful example of a force of Space Marines who feel forsaken by the Imperium that they love, and instead choose simply to survive instead of facing a pointless and ignominious death. How they're consistently characterized as underpowered and on the edge of destruction is great, and probably the primary reason I've put them in B tier, to be honest. Really keeping it consistent. Similarly, staying consistent with the other two themes, first being that Renegades cannot really survive on their own, thus they have to head for the Eye of Terror, and of course falling to chaos as their ultimate fate. How compelling is their fall and fate on a scale of tragic and compelling to contrived, however? I think it's kind of compelling. Not quite as compelling as some of the earlier B tier entries, but still really good. And finally, if this chapter is a part of any stories, narratives, or mentions, do they positively contribute to those stories, narratives, or mentions? How could I possibly fault a force of Space Marines for making a deal with Eldar only to basically kneecap them whilst walking out the door? 10 out of 10. Actual Renegade petty behavior, and I'm all here for it, man. All in all, great depiction of Renegades despite only being a small warband of like 30 men. Really good job. Edit and update. Added this in after I wrote the whole script. Just adding on to this, Games Workshop made a huge lore update to the Avenging Suns with the recent 500 Worlds books. It's long been established that the Avenging Suns have been chosen as one of the honored shield chapters of Ultramar, which is cool because it shows that the Imperium and the galaxy, and maybe more importantly, the characterization of Guilliman himself, knows that a chapter can be flawed or have a flaw, have its sons lose their way, and still be one of the exemplars of their own order. However, Games Workshop, for a reason that I've made no secret of my distaste for in the AA Discord, have one throwaway line in the 500 Worlds books that states the Avenging Suns chapter was killed in its entirety 1 year before Guilliman's return. And the Avenging Suns we see taking up the mantle of S.H.I.E.L.D. chapter are an entirely new Ultima founding chapter of the same name. I'm not going to keep talking about this. I'm going to spare you from my rants. I think this is so dumb. Yeah. Just so inane. Alright, moving on. Constantinus' Sons of Guilliman. This is a fun one, and similar to a few of our previous entries combined. So, the chapter. The Sons of Guilliman has, as of the 8th edition Ultramarines Codex supplement, long been regarded by the Imperium as an atypical Ultramarines successor chapter, eschewing their parent chapter's adherence to the Codex Astartes in favor of less conventional approaches to war and chapter structure. As per Imperial Armor Volume 2 2nd ed and the aforementioned supplement, they come from a death world / desert world known as Presidia. Or Presidia. Presidia? which, as of the current setting, sits on the edge of the Great Rift in the Ultima Segmentum, within Imperium Sanctus, mind you. Now, no source provides any information as to why exactly the chapter is codex divergent, or how they're codex divergent, though it is said that they push themselves out of some notion to make sure their namesake isn't invalid. They've been in a great many important campaigns, which is to be expected of an old chapter founded in M33. They fought alongside the Night Reapers and Warbearers chapters during the Siege of Lacedaemon, at the end of M33 fighting hordes of orcs. In M37 they would lose a number of their brothers to a demonic incursion, but would be avenged by the Grey Knights, and 3,000 years later at the end of M41, Uriel Ventress would return a not insignificant amount of war gear to the Sons of Guilliman, following the Ultramarines 4th Company engaging in a campaign in the same region. The chapter appeared most recently in canon as per the 3rd Ed Codex Armageddon, deploying over half of their chapter to the Third War of Armageddon. Anyways, this isn't actually about the Sons of Guilliman. This is about Constantinus' Sons of Guilliman. And you might rightly be asking, who the hell is Constantinus? Well, Constantinus was a sergeant of the Sons of Guilliman 4th Company. As told to us in the 4th edition Chaos Space Marine Codex, he and his men fought off Tyranids from the world of Nova Terra. And yes, that's the same Nova Terra who, 5,000 years prior, were the seat of power of the Nova Terra Interregnum, the largest civil war the Imperium had experienced since the Horus Heresy. Anyways, after neutralizing the Tyranids and liberating the population, Constantinus and his men were basically told they must remain behind on Nova Terra to keep an eye out in case any Genestealer cults appear. Over the course of 3 years, Constantinus and his small contingent of Space Marines would scour Nova Terra's complex cave systems for Tyranid remnants and Genestealers, purging them all. Eventually, though, word reached Constantinus that the ruling elite of Nova Terra, the noble aristocracy of Syrtis, has in fact succumbed to the Genestealers and were now their thralls. Being a good Space Marine, Constantinus wasted no time in annihilating the entire ruling class of Syrtis. However, in a shock turn of events, it turns out that the ruling class of Nova Terra were actually beloved by their people. Thus, the population rose up against the Space Marines in civil riots. Obviously, the vast majority of Astartes are not equipped to deal with this kind of unrest, at least not in a soft way. And so they did what any good hammer would do, and they whacked the nail as hard as possible. Overnight, entire chunks of the city of Syrtis were razed to the ground, and swathes of civilians were slaughtered. As it turns out, Constantinus was super unhappy about his assignment to Nova Terra, and had been holding a growing resentment against the Imperium of Man. In the wake of his slaughter, he met the people of Nova Terra and declared himself the new ruler of the world, vowing to free the planet and its people from the Imperium's grasp. Of course, when it came to the atrocities he had committed against the people of Syrtis and Nova Terra, Constantinus simply blamed the Emperor himself for making him a monster. And thus began Constantinus' Sons of Guilliman's reign and their status as renegade Space Marines. As you might expect, Constantinus was hardly suited for this task, and it wasn't long before Nova Terra descended into total anarchy. Though, said anarchy did cause something interesting to happen. Chaos began to take root in the civilian population of the world, and it wasn't long before that began to attract the attention of Chaos Space Marine warbats. As we see in the short story Liberator 2012, heretic Astartes descended upon the world one by one. Constantinus goaded and slew their leaders, and in doing so won the service of their men. Over a short period of time, he had begun to amass a veritable army of traitor Astartes under his banner. Though, of course, as you once again might have expected, this quickly led to his own fall to the ruinous powers. Constantinus renamed Nova Terra, dubbing it Constantinium in honor of himself, and over the course of a decade took his army to the surrounding Vidrus sector, conquering its various worlds. A chapter known as the Iron Knights, successors of Rogel Dawn from an even earlier founding than the Sons of Guilliman, took up the charge of defeating Constantinus' forces. The Iron Knights themselves are an interesting, albeit brief chapter, who actually had a small portion of their own number fall to chaos, though it's not really expanded upon. It might still help to explain some of their motivations for the role in this task though. It took them 13 long years of brutal war to reach their goal. Though, curiously, it was never the Iron Knights who brought Constantinus low himself. Much like with the Renegade chapter master of the Sons of Pertinax and the attempt on Gabriel Seth's life, Constantinus was killed specifically by an agent of the Officio Assassinorum. A number more things happened following these events, and we'll come back to those shortly, but suffice it to say, elements of Constantinus' regime still continue to exist on Nova Terra. Though the 4th edition Chaos Space Marines Codex doesn't really go into much detail, it's my belief that he's now some kind of underground legend to those on the world who seek to oppose the Imperium. Though of course this last bit really is just me speculating. So let's take a look at our criterion once more, except this time for Constantinus' Sons of Guilliman. Does their story make sense within the universe? Absolutely, 100% makes sense. It acknowledges and builds off of so many great Renegade precedents. Empire building is punishable by death, falling to chaos and inquisitorial assassins guaranteed. I think it's a really fun notion to think about how Renegades have these three fates, death, corruption, or penance, and how Constantinus' Sons of Guilliman actually selected corruption and death. How compelling is their fall and fate on a scale of tragic and compelling to contrived? Definitely a little bit contrived here. I think one thing I find kind of funny about this tale is how some uppity Space Marine sergeant just kind of dump trucks multiple Chaos champions and their men just decide to follow him. I suppose Constantinus has to be far more charismatic than the lore surrounding him lets on. But as everything else surrounding these renegades is done so well, I'm prepared to forgive it. If the chapter is part of any stories, narratives, or mentions, do they contribute to those stories, narratives, or mentions positively? For sure. It's interesting how Renegade lore is kind of split 50-50 between Chaos Space Marine codices and Space Marine codices. Liberator is a really fun story, and if I haven't done so already, I definitely intend to use it for a few Astartes Anonymous shorts. All in all, great depiction of Renegades, reinforcing elements we know are true of how the Imperium treats Renegades, and the themes and motifs that recur with Renegades. Only real critique is that they weren't true Renegades for very long, though I think it's also true that when you're separated from the Imperium, chaos just kind of will get you eventually. Some quickly, some slowly, Coming in for a second day of recording audio to get this done. Oh my goodness, this script is so big. Ugh. And finally, to end off B tier, we have the Night Reapers. I said there was some events that took place after Constantinus was killed that we'd get back to? Well, as it turns out, renegades beget renegades. You see, we're told in Imperial Armor Volume 13 that as Constantinus' armies brought their wars into the Vidris sector, his army was so overwhelmingly massive that when the Night Reapers chapter, who was stationed upon a shrine world called Salvation Gamma, caught wind of the coming horde of heretic Astartes, they took extreme measures. Without wasting a moment, the entire chapter took to orbit and unleashed Exterminatus, laying waste to the entire world of Salvation Gamma with billions of people upon it. When telling the wider Imperium of the reasoning behind their actions, they simply decided that in the face of the forces headed their way, a quick death was the most merciful thing they could do for those upon the Shrine World. Now, as you may well know, the Ecclesiarchy has overwhelming sway in almost every facet of the Imperium, and when word reached them that a Space Marine chapter had reduced a Shrine World to ash without so much as attempting to defend it, they launched a grievance of such immense vigor to the Senatorum Imperialis that the Night Reapers chapter whole received a rare sanction of gross dereliction of duty. Now, normally when this kind of stuff happens with Space Marines, a chapter would be forced to undergo some kind of penitence, but unfortunately for the Night Reapers, the Imperium was not feeling so generous. The chapter ostensibly had its entire modus operandi changed, and was consigned to operate forevermore along the outermost edges of the Lana Rifts. For most of the known Imperial history, the Lana Rifts were entirely untouchable, inhabited by rebel human and Xenos coalitions, specifically a Xenos that we know as the Helgramite. Now, without getting into too much detail, according to Imperial Armor Volume 10, the Helgramite were eventually defeated by the Sons of Medusa chapter. However, even after the Helgramite's destruction, that region of space remains undisputably a hellscape, housing God knows what, including but not limited to the Silent Forge, a Dark Mechanicum Forge world, and at the time, the Perrin Cross, an ungodly space hog predating humanity so massive that it even has its own atmosphere. Now, this next bit is admittedly personal conjecture, but the way I see it, Loyalists do not simply survive deep in the Lana Rifts, no more than one would expect Loyalist forces to just survive existing purely in the Ghoul or Halo stars, right? These are places in the galaxy that, even in the current setting, are wholly unsafe for everyone not affiliated with the ruinous powers, and even then it's not safe for them. To me, it's like the Night Reapers basically received an official letter condemning them to die without actually saying so. The Night Reapers, however, dutiful as they were, took up the challenge. Though within a decade, all communication with the chapter was lost. Shortly after this, the rogue trader Baron Strauss-Yuen's fleet was found all but annihilated on the edge of the Lana Rifts, and for reasons Imperial Armor Volume 13, the Imperium found damning evidence in the wreckage that the Night Reapers were to blame for the death of the rogue trader and his fleet. Thus, the Night Reapers were officially declared excommunicate traitoris and had become renegades. Initially responding, 4 companies of the Avenging Sons chapter came to seize the perpetrators, but were repelled by unusual weaponry. Wasting no time, the Imperium sent both the Red Templars chapter and the Minotaurs chapter to deal with the Night Reaper problem. Of course, the Minotaurs need no introduction. However, the Red Templars chapter are known for their zealotry and search and destroy campaigns. War would come to the Night Reapers. Known in Imperial records as the harrowing of the Night Reapers, the Renegades would hold their own against 2 of the most lethal Space Marine chapters the Imperium has ever produced. So, how exactly does a Renegade chapter, entirely without the Imperium's support, hold off such a force? Well, in their brief time in the Lana Rifts, the Renegades had managed to get their hands on and implement troves of Xeno weaponry and technology into their war doctrine. From Imperial Armor Volume 12, we know that said weaponry came from the since-destroyed Helgramite. Though as good as such an asset is, it only managed to keep the 2 pursuing chapters at bay for so long. After 3 short years, the now substantially weakened Night Reapers would withdraw to the Perrin Cross. You know, the aforementioned Mega Space Hulk. As the Minotaurs and Red Templars prepared for their final attack, they were joined by a small contingent of none other than the Grey Knights. It's worth noting at this time, the Night Reapers had begun to work alongside the local Dark Mechanicum forces to fend off the Imperium's war machine. As the battle on the Space Hulk reached its peak, the leading Grey Knight captain ordered everyone acquiesce to his command and retreat. In a confusing series of events, the Perrin Cross then fell victim to several nuclear explosions as the Night Reapers were attempting to extract some Xeno artifact from its core. The Night Reapers were then recorded as destroyed, and large numbers of both the Grey Knights and Minotaurs were killed. However, Imperial Armor states that Asterion Moloch, chapter master of the Minotaurs, survived, and funnily enough, this isn't the only time Asterion Moloch is recorded as surviving something nigh impossible. But that's a topic for another video. But something I wanted to mention now, just because I don't think I'll find another good opportunity to mention it. You know the Astraeus Super Heavy tank, this tank? The single most powerful Primaris-era ground vehicle devised by Belisarius Karl. Well, as it turns out, according to the Astraeus Super Heavy tank rule sheet from, I think, 8th edition? Or 7th edition? No, 8th edition. One or the other. The STC and information required to create the tank was actually provided by the Minotaurs chapter to Belisarius Karl directly, taken from the Perrin Cross Space Hulk. So whilst it's not immediately clear what, something from pre-Imperial civilization that birthed the Hulk is present within the Astraeus tanks. Though the Imperium closed the book on the Night Reapers that day on the Space Hulk, they would appear again just before the turn of the millennium in 999.M41, as they fought an Ordo Malleus Inquisitor, accompanied by a company of Red Hunters Space Marines. The Red Hunters, in case you were unaware, are the unofficial Space Marine chapter of the Inquisition. I did a video on them a while back. They're an incredible and understated chapter, and were actually the chapter responsible for releasing Space Marines Titus, the Titus, from the Inquisition, facilitating his handover to the Death Watch, as per White Dwarf 498. In any event, the Red Hunters company present and the Inquisition fought the Night Reapers on multiple worlds. However, the Red Hunters contingent was defeated and forced to retreat after accidentally killing the Inquisitor with a stray artillery shell, whilst trying to fight the Night Reapers' demon engines, confirming that the Renegades ultimately fell to chaos. The Inquisition has since highlighted the Night Reapers as a Chaos warband, with a particularly close relationship with the Dark Mechanicum. The Night Reapers are one of those forces with a real curious relationship to the current setting. They're also a personal point of pain for me, because as most of us are aware, the transition from Firstborn to Primaris and the renaissance of 40k, it saw an awful lot of interesting storylines hastily closed with various levels of dissatisfaction amongst fans. And I personally find the Night Reapers, the Perrin Cross, and the story with the Red Templars, Red Hunters, Minotaurs, Grey Knights, the Inquisition, and the Dark Mechanicum to wholeheartedly be cut short. We managed to get so much intrigue and information from 3 or 4 Imperial Armor compendiums. I really don't think there's any other Renegade chapters in B tier that deserve an actual novel quite like the Night Reapers do. Right, back to our criterions to close off B tier. Does their story make sense within the universe, or does it strain credibility? I believe it makes a lot of sense. A chapter that basically abandoned the Imperium after choosing what was, in their eyes, a mercy, only to be condemned by the cult of the Emperor. One of the things I really love about the Night Reaper's surrounding narrative is how it shows that the Imperium will stop at nothing to kill excommunicats. It doesn't matter if you hide in the Ghoul Stars, the Halo Stars, the Lana Rifts, whatever. It doesn't matter if you ally yourself with Xenos or with Chaos. The only thing worse than a heretic is an apostate. To operate outside of the bounds of the Imperium of Man as Space Marines is to court death. Remember, the Imperium, it does not forget and it does not forgive. How compelling is their fall and fate on a scale of tragic and compelling to contrived? I think this might be their weak point that keeps them from A tier, honestly. It's not that I think they're particularly contrived, but I think there's perhaps a lack of tragedy. But at the same time, that's a problem that could be fixed very quickly if someone wrote them an actual novel, which they definitely deserve. If this chapter is a part of any stories, narratives, or mentions, do they positively contribute to them? I think they're a great boon, honestly. I think my little rant about them deserving an actual narrative expansion really shows just how much they're a brilliant sub-faction, who's managed to add mountains of intrigue to all the other factions that they've interacted with. Oh, so here it is. We're 25 pages into this script, and we're finally done with B tier. Oh my goodness. Okay. Moving on into A tier. I think I mentioned earlier in the video that A tier is a little skewed, of which you'll see why shortly. However, to begin A tier, I wanted to talk about a chapter that I am extremely fond of, and I'm definitely more than a little biased towards. The Relictors. I think one of the reasons I like the Relictors so much is they feel like someone's beloved fan project, a real goal for any 40k Space Marine homebrew to aspire to. Though, before I get into the meat and veg of their story, there's one thing about the Relictors I want to bitch about. And to be honest, it's less the Relictors and more the 40k Lexicanum. I know I've spoken about Lexicanum already in this video. You see, whilst the Lexicanum is good for producing the location of any particular bit of lore, it's often wrong about the specifics of an actual bit of lore. So when I say often, I don't mean all the time, I don't even mean most of the time, hell, I don't even mean commonly. However, it's wrong often enough that one shouldn't really take what it says at face value on a topic that you've got an actual vested interest in without going through its sourcing yourself. Now, how does this pertain to the Relictors? Well, the Lexicanum claims the Relictors chapter use both Dark Angels and Ultramarine Geneseed, which would make them, canonically at least, the only chapter to be confirmed as using chimeric or joined Geneseed. However, the source the Lexicanum puts forward for this is an insert from the Architect of Fate anthology book. I've looked at said insert sheet, and it confirms nothing of the sort. So unless there's a second insert sheet, or I'm reading it wrong, and I'm open to the possibility that I'm reading it wrong. You know, I'm open to the possibility that I've just missed something, right? I think I need to say they are one or the other. If you've got a source of them being of dual Geneseed and I am wrong, could you go into the AA Discord, the Astartes Discord link down below, and just send it to me and I'll pin it in a comment or something? Anyways, yeah, right, the Relictors. From the novel Angron's Monolith 2014 and the Relictors page from the now defunct Armageddon 3 webpage, we know of a chapter called The Fireclaws. Founded in M36, the Fireclaws patrolled the area surrounding the Eye of Terror as one of the Astartes Praeses chapters. 20 chapters, 20,000 Space Marines with a singular unified goal to guard the Eye of Terror, as per White Dwarf 281. However, from the Dark Creed novel 2010, we know that in the era just before the return of Guilliman, one had been destroyed and another fallen to chaos. The Fireclaws, as expected of Space Marines of that region, were regular allies of Cadians, commonly seen fighting along the Cadian regiments. As per Angron's Monolith, a great Space Hulk would leave the Imperium, and the Fireclaws would take up the task of investigating its appearance. Dubbed the Captor of Sin, the Space Hulk bore a Chaos Warband, led by an unnaturally powerful champion of Tzeentch, called the Excoriator. Consigning a Terminator squad, joined by a radical Inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus, the Fireclaw's force teleported onto the Space Hulk after they had crippled it with void salvos. Forcing the Heretic Astartes back into the central portion of the vessel, they made their last stand. The champion of Tzeentch would fight both the Fireclaw's librarian known as Decario and the Radical Inquisitor. Unfortunately, it wasn't a fair fight, as the Tzeentchian champion's demon sword had a great power of a greater demon bound within it. The Inquisitor was grievously wounded and thrown to the ground, ground. Then the librarian's force weapon was shattered, and he too was forced back as his Terminator armor was ripped open. In a quick motion, the librarian with his power fist tore the warrior's sword arm clean off, though this seemingly only enraged the warrior, who would go on to quickly dispatch 4 more Terminators in his fury. In a panic, the librarian reached for the closest weapon he could get his hands on and swung for the champion, decapitating him. The reprieve lasted only a few moments though, as Decario stood there, looked at the weapon in his hand that he used to dispatch his foe, and realized it was the Demon Blade. Within seconds, the librarian felt a great surge of power rushing through him. Consciously, he felt as though his union with this weapon could bring about the death of Chaos itself. However, as many 40k stories will tell us, Space Marine librarians are often the ultimate prize of the Dark God's machinations. The injured Inquisitor immediately warned Decario there and then. The handling of Chaos weaponry was surely possible, but it required a great deal of caution and an even greater deal of training. Handing the weapon over to the Inquisitor, they returned to the Fireclaw's flagship to confer with the Chapter Master, who was then seemingly swayed by the Inquisitor and Decario. In fact, so smitten with their prize and the possibility of fighting fire with fire was he, that over the coming decades, the Fireclaw's MO was changed to the recovery and use of Chaos weapons and relics. Thus, the chapter was renamed the Relictors in honor of what they presumably believed was this most noble goal. An indeterminable number of years would pass, and the exact details of the Imperium's investigations and leanings are still not fully known. However, an Inquisitorial Cell is a specific type of grouping of Inquisitors. I go over them in my Inquisition video, link down below. Alongside the chapter masters of 4 different chapters, who as far as I can tell are not named, with an Emperor-class battleship in tow, descended upon the Relictors' Fortress Monastery, charging them as traitors and renegades for their ever-growing use of Chaos artifacts. However, the Relictors did not fight back. Because of their acquiescence, were instead demanded to undertake a 100-year penitent crusade. Their cooperation with the Inquisitor from the Space Hulk was brought to light, and said Inquisitor was executed by his peers. Now, to my knowledge, when a Space Marine chapter is sent on a penitent crusade, they're usually sent to a part of space where the Imperium is beleaguered or overrun more than usual. Having a chapter on Penitent Crusade turn up to help you is genuinely a really good thing, as they have the opportunity to turn the tides in battles the Imperium would have otherwise deemed hopeless. However, this wasn't really the case with the Relictors. As per the 3rd edition codex of the same name, the Relictors were condemned to spend 100 years on Armageddon. Though despite the all-year-round need for reinforcements that the Third War of Armageddon would call for, the Relictors would do very little to actually help Imperial forces once they'd arrived on the world, opting instead to pursue their own ends. The Relictors would claim to be hunting feral orcs hidden deep within Armageddon's largely deserted jungles, but in truth would be seeking out a unique Chaos artifact known as Angron's Monolith, with the help of yet another radical Inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus, known as Halstrand. As per Codex Inquisition 2013, Halstrand, curiously, was a part of the Xanthite Order, a uniquely extreme group of Inquisitors, even by radical standards. Created in M32, its original founder, Lord Inquisitor Zaranchek Xanthus, was executed as a heretic. As, you see, his order, the Xanthites, sole modus operandi was to use and master Chaos to defeat Chaos. So one could understand why a radical Xanthite Inquisitor would take such a keen interest in the Relictors. By this time, Decario had ascended to be the chapter's chief librarian, and it was Decario who would attempt to extract a shard from Angron's monolith. Ostensibly a fragment from an axe wielded by the demon Primarch Angron during the First War of Armageddon. As the librarian attempted to extract the shard, it unleashed a form of warp beacon that drew in all of the local feral orc forces to their location. The fighting was fierce, and as time drew on, became more and more dire, until a relictant named Nico Tarrant took a shard from the monolith and used it to turn the tide of the battle. Once again, the Relictors would be saved by a member of their number using the powers of Chaos to fight the enemies of man. The chapter would go on to take another pair of shards from the monolith before leaving. After this brief series of events, the chapter's librarians would all receive a joint vision. A vision of a bloody lidless eye. Seeing it as a sign, they would take to their starfort and forsake their duty on Armageddon, and, you guessed it, make for the Eye of Terror, officially becoming Renegade Space Marines. Though the excommunication itself wouldn't come right away, it would still come. From White Dwarf 286, we know that the next sighting of the Relictors was at the opening of the 13th Black Crusade. The chapter, despite still being totally loyal at this point, refused to cooperate with Imperial forces. Whilst this undoubtedly annoyed all present, Logan Grimnar, chapter master of the Space Wolves, took an excess of personal offense to the Relictors' refusal to cooperate. According to Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2 and the Battlefleet Gothic Armada book, the chapter would meet the Night Lords at the agri-world of Exultra Minor, though the sources indicate that the objectives sought after by both parties were never clearly defined. And if you may indulge in some inference, I don't think anyone would be surprised if, once again, Chaos Relics were the things at stake. The chapter also saw war against the Wordbearers on the nearby world of Subiaco Diablo. Though, as White Dwarf states, the Relictors fought more than just the forces of Chaos during the 13th Black Crusade, but also faced off against Eldar during this time. As Abaddon's war worsened, the Relictors would return to fight beside the warriors of the Imperium. However, they would continue to make closer and closer to the Eye of Terror in search of Chaos relics to use against the Despoiler's forces. This would see the Relictors arrive at the Diomedes Archive. As detailed in the later White Dwarf 295, the archive was built on a world known as Fremus, some 4 millennia prior, deep within a mountain peak with few means of entry or escape. Sealed off by the Ordo Malleus in mid-M41, long before the events of the 13th Black Crusade, only the highest-ranking officials of Terra itself were aware of what was sealed within the archive. It's revealed to us here that it was the original Demon Blade, taken by Decario all those years ago, that whispered to the chapter to come to this place. With a single squad of Space Marines, the chapter slew the Imperial defenders of the archive. It's written that the Relictors found an artifact of immense power at the core of the archive, though it's not explained what exactly the relic or artifact is. We know that the chapter stored it in a stasis chest and had intended for only a select few of their most stalwart and pure librarians to study it. However, this prize could not be savoured, as the Inquisition and the Grey Knights came for the Relictors. Agents of the Ordo Malleus destroyed the Relictors' mobile star fortress, and the vast majority of the chapter stationed within. One is left to assume that the chapter's dereliction of Armageddon and their insubordination during the 13th Black Crusade had finally caught up with them. The comparative handful of Relictors who survived the Inquisition's final condemnation fled into the Eye of Terror, never to be seen again. It's unknown who survives, be it Decario, the chief librarian who had driven a large part of the Relictors' story, or Articus Bardane, the chapter master of the Relictors who I've done you all a disservice by not talking about thus far. Well, let me tell you now. We know from Index Astartes 3, 2003, that Bardane was the son of a chieftain from the chapter's homeworld, and had become learned in the arts of war even before becoming an Astartes. Be it from grit alone or perhaps something more prophetic, Bardane was chosen personally by the librarians of the time to join the chapter. He rose through the ranks rapidly, and became privy to the various secrets of the Relictors' conclave. It's said that he had a unique ability to master and perhaps even dominate chaos weaponry. With his will and might, he led the chapter into the Eye of Terror many times to claim various relics of chaos for himself and his brothers. On one such excursion, the chapter would find themselves fighting on the demon world of Eidolon, a former Eldar maiden world. And search as I might, I've yet to find any relation to this world's name and the commander Eidolon of the Emperor's Children. I don't think they're connected. There, Bardane would face a great enemy, a champion of Slanesh who possessed a great and terrible weapon known as the Screaming Flail, a cursed weapon with several eternally screaming demon faces bound to it. Bardane would take the flail and use it to annihilate that champion's warband with ease. And upon returning from that campaign, Bardane would redub the weapon the Articus Scourge. His valor and lethality over this campaign is what would lead him to the role of chapter master of the Relictors. Though one source, as mentioned before, tells us of the Relictors' confrontation with the Space Wolves and the angering of Logan Grimnar. Index Astartes 3 also tells us that Articus Bardane famously argued with Dante of the Blood Angels as well. It's unknown if Articus Bardane or Decario survived the Grey Knight's attack, but should they have survived? Should they have made it successfully into the Eye of Terror? And should they give themselves to the ruinous powers? I cannot possibly imagine a pair of space marines that the Dark Gods could find more powerful avatars in, as even without the corruption of chaos, they are masters of it. They're a chapter of warriors who can count themselves entirely alongside the likes of Logan Grimnar of the Space Wolves, and Castellan Crow of the Grey Knights, as space marines capable of withstanding the corrupting influence of demon weapons. So let's have a look at our criterions. Does their story make sense within the universe, or does it strain credibility? I'd say for the most part it does. I think there's two slight bits that strain credibility that I want to look at though. The first being the general idea that the chapter is this authority on mastering demon weapons. We know from Crow and Grimnar, as well as every single character in 40k who's ever been corrupted by some sort of chaos trinket, that fending off that sort of thing is a gargantuan task. But I think this could have been remedied with just one little change that I really think could have fit very easily into their lore, and that's just a small bit of text somewhere talking about how a number of their marines do fall to chaos, you know? It would feed into the Inquisition's suspicions and their excommunication really easily as well, creating an extra justification for it. All that being said, the lore that really started that was from 2003, so a long time ago. The later entries post-2010 were a lot less heavy-handed with their depictions, so I think we can give them a little leeway. How compelling is their fall on a scale of tragic and compelling to contrived? I don't think their fall, fate, and story was contrived at all. I think they made mistakes, they were selfish, and they suffered for it. And the specifics of their punishment were consistent with everything we've discussed so far about Renegade Space Marines. If this chapter is a part of any stories, narratives, or mentions, do they positively contribute to those stories, narratives, or mentions? Or do they detract from them? Honestly, answering this is really fun because we actually only scratch the surface of what the books about the Relictors actually include. Sure, it's not loads like the Ultramarines or whatnot, right? But you know how we said that Renegade chapters are often depicted in either Space Marine codices or Chaos Space Marine codices? Well, the Relictors are one of the few chapters that's actually depicted in both, and more. I think they're an exceptional chapter, and whilst a little bit of that goofy essence of early 40k has seeped in with Index Astartes 3, and whilst a lot of lore in Index Astartes could be considered out of date, they're still amazing reads. Not to mention the Relictors, I think, and I could be wrong on this, but at this point I'm like 14,000 words into the script and I'm on page 30, and you know, I can't be asked to check. We're one of, if not the first Renegade chapters that Games Workshop made. But yeah, a seriously great chapter, still following our themes of death, corruption, penance, with the chapter's tale actually including elements of literally all three of those fates. Death because the vast majority of the chapter was ultimately wiped out by the Grey Knights, corruption because the few remaining warriors fled into the Eye of Terror, not to mention they had a greater demon inside a sword whispering guidance to them the whole way, and penance because the Imperium of Man did actually give them an opportunity to redeem themselves, an opportunity that they wasted, consistently fulfilling the themes of tragedy that are always seen with Renegade Space Marines. So yeah, I'm a big fan of the Relictors, definitely A tier for me, 100%. Right, I'm not going to dwell on this next one for long. The Badab Secessionist chapters. Every 40k YouTuber and their mother has covered Badab. And I'm gonna be honest, it'd be stiff competition to talk about them even if it weren't just gonna be some insert in a tier list. However, for the duration of Badab, the Secessionist chapters were, in fact, renegades, a coalition of renegades. The most well-known coalition of renegades in all of Warhammer 40k, the Mantis Warriors, the Lamenters, the Executioners, and of course, the Astral Claws, who would go on to become one of the greatest Chaos Space Marine pseudo-legions in the entire setting, in, mind you, a short space of time that puts Abaddon's Black Legion to shame. The story of these chapters is so iconic and so important to this list as well, because of how overwhelmingly it reinforces how the Imperium of Man at large views dissident Space Marines. And I, of course, use the word dissident, not chaos very specifically. No matter a chapter's means, intention, reputation, or moral standing, the Imperium of Man does not tolerate Astartes who fall out of line. The Badab Imperial Armor Compendiums are some of the best index-style lore chunks Games Workshop has ever made. They go into great detail about the various nuances of why and how these chapters rebelled, and what became of them. They are sensational. If you want the full beans of Badab, I personally recommend the Remembrances video, which I'll also link down below. It's about an hour long, and gives the various factions and characters the full spotlight they deserve. So, very quickly, does their story make sense within the universe, or does it strain credibility? 100% makes sense. Each of the various Badab Secessionist chapters has a story that's still ongoing. Recently, in the 500 Worlds books, Rabute Gilliman has ostensibly rescinded the long-held penitent crusades of the Mantis Warriors, Lamenters, and Executioners, and has instead charged them with hunting down Huron Blackheart, the orchestrator of the Badab Rebellion. Though this is all much to the chagrin of the Order Astartes, who, true to form, are entirely unforgiving of this trio of ex-renegades. I personally also really like this. because this is the second or third instance in canon where the Ordo Astartes has, in equal parts brazenly and secretly, voiced a distaste for the Primarch of the Ultramarines. It'll be interesting to see how the Ordo Astartes feels about Lionel Johnson's return and his forgiving of the Fallen. How compelling is their fallen fate on a scale of tragic and compelling to contrived? I personally think their fall, fate, and redemption is very compelling. The tragedy of it, though, is that these chapters show just how far Space Marines will go to uphold their oaths. Definitely A tier for all the Badab secessionists. Go watch the Remembrances video, or your favorite YouTuber's video on Badab. Maybe we'll do one day. We probably will, not today. The worst. Right, if you have skipped the entire video just to get here, then, well, you're missing some vital context, and here's the problem with that. I'm about to besmirch two very popular groups of Space Marines, a relatively popular 40k novel, and a relatively popular 40k author. The last hour or so of dialogue, I like to think we have shared about the consistent characterizations of renegades is sincerely and deeply important as to said besmirching. Unfortunately, I believe the renegades I'm about to talk about are not just the worst written renegades in 40k, but actually just one of the most nonsensical chapters in 40k too. That said, there are some elements of the renegades I'm about to mention that I do like, and that I do think are kind of neat, and of course I will do my best to give them a fair shake. Going into this, do understand, I'm not just a professional hater. The regular audience of the Astartes Anonymous Twitch stream and the YouTube podcast from the second channel are very familiar with what I'm about to talk about, as my problem with this chapter has, in a way, become my very own Roman Empire. So, without further ado, which chapter am I talking about? The Ashen Claws. To start with, we actually get to talk about why the Ashen Claws are actually pretty cool. That being from their Horus Heresy era lore. Almost all of the following lore, for now, comes from Horus Heresy Book 6 Retribution, and a little bit from Horus Heresy Book 3 Extermination, but mostly Book 6. As many of you know, the Space Marine legions during the time of the Great Crusade were divided into companies and chapters. Not necessarily chapters in the way we understand them in 40k, but still individual groups of Space Marines that could contain many thousands of Astartes under a sub-banner of their legion. Also, before someone attempts to shoot me, the lore on legion numbers is super inconsistent. Whilst Liber Astartes 3rd edition tells us a legion chapter contains up to 2,000 Marines, other black books have shown us some contain up to 6,000 Marines. And don't even get me started on total legion numbers, there is a bunch of conflicting sources. And besides, that isn't even our dog race for today. All you need to know for the purpose of this is that an individual legion chapter was massive. The 18th chapter of the Raven Guard Legion, colloquially known as the Ashen Claws, were largely trained by Horus Lupercal himself. This isn't actually an uncommon thing with the Raven Guard. Before their reunification with their Primarch Corvus Corax, much of the Raven Guard Legion operated as an extended arm of the soon-to-be War Master. Even after the Raven Lord's reunion with the Emperor and his sons, the Terminator elite of the Raven Guard Legion remained the Terran-born Astartes who were trained alongside the Justarin of the Sons of Horus. As you've likely gleaned from this, the Ashen Claws had a way of war that was far more brutal than the majority of their legion. About a year after the Council of Nicaea, and still a few years before the Horus Heresy proper began, a great battle was fought by the Raven Guard and Lunar Wolves against a Xenos parasite, known as the Unsighted Kings. The war was exceedingly costly for the Raven Guard, and taught the Primarch Corvus Corax a lot about what kind of a Primarch and leader he wanted to be. To this end, the Raven Lord would ostensibly banish elements of his own legion who he felt were incompatible with his way of war. That banishment would see those warriors selected sent to the Ghoul Stars, one of the most intensely dangerous areas of the galaxy. Amongst these warriors banished were swathes of Terran-born legionaries, warriors who had fought too long by the side of Horus, and over 4,000 warriors of the 18th chapter, the Ashen Claws. This warband, of at least 4,000, would go on to abandon its honours and become the first true Black Shields of the Horus Heresy. And as the Horus Heresy unfolded, the Ashen Claws would not sit quietly in the Ghoul Stars. The wayward sons of Korax would make a series of extremely successful hit-and-run strikes on the Nostromo sector, sacking the realm of the Night Lord's Legion as it went. Their warring gave confidence to the once suppressed race of the Crave, which allowed these Xenos to spread out and further cripple the Night Lord's homeworlds and fortresses. The Crave, for those who don't know, are a race of winged Xeno-vampires that once had the power to rival a Space Marine Legion. It was the Crusade-era Dark Angels who were the ones to subdue them long before these events. I covered them in my 40k Vampires video from last year, which you can watch here if you're interested. The link will be in the description down below. However, as the heresy drew on, the Ashen Claws wouldn't restrict their attacks to just the traitors, and instead using their might and relative ignorable status to also raid loyalist factions as well. One of the few communications the Ashen Claws had with the wider Imperium during this time was with Arceus Odenathus, the 10th chapter commander of the Ultramarines, who was simply told that the Ashen Claws would fight solely for themselves. By the time of the Scouring after the closing of the Horus Heresy, the just-created Angels Vermilion would undertake a campaign to bring war to the home turf of the Night Lords, only to find it largely razed to the ground. The Sons of Sanguinius believed it was the Ashen Claws who were the perpetrators of this destruction, unrestricted by the constraints of the newly minted Codex Astartes. The several thousand-strong Ashen Claws likely unleashed their Crusade-era arsenal on the Night Lords, who by this time would have been crippled from the Thramis Crusade, the Siege of Terror, and the Dark Angels' Vengeance Crusade. Now, sadly, we must leap 10,000 years into the future. It is a great tragedy for this chapter and this chapter's believability that the lore actually ignores 10,000 years of history, as everything we know about the Ashen Claws jumps from the closing of the Horus Heresy all the way right up to modern 40k, with nothing tangible to really help us fill in the blanks. This is something I'll talk about later, but it is extremely contrived. In fact, all we really know about the Ashen Claws during this time is that they remain deeply embedded in the Ghoul Stars, continuing to do war with its denizens. The rest of the Ashen Claws lore that we're going to talk about comes from Robbie McNiven's Outer Dark, the second novel in the Karl series. Used ostensibly as a tertiary plot device, a walking MacGuffin, if you will, the Ashen Claws arrive just in time to help their frenemies. The Karl chapter make a stand against the oncoming Tyranid Genestealer assault on the world of Piety 5 in the Ghoul Stars. The Ashen Claws arrive and argue with the Karl present, before striking a bargain that may turn the tide of the coming conflict. The rest of the Karl narrative happens, and then we see Nahat Nev, the chapter master of the Ashen Claws, basically getting verbally forced into submission by Tybros the Redwake himself, the chapter master of the Karl. But not before the Ashen Claw basically infers that Tybros' signature gauntlets, Hunger and Slake, are actually property of the Ashen Claws. During the novel, we learn that the Ashen Claws have erected their own empire in the Ghoul Stars. We learn that the Ashen Claws are somewhat diminished from their days of the Great Crusade, but are still far greater, stronger, and more numerous than any Space Marine chapter in the entire setting, save maybe the Black Templars. Nahat Nev essentially tells Tybros that he'll destroy the Karl fleet if he does not return the gauntlets Hunger and Slake. Tybros doesn't really call his bluff as much as he just kinda grinds through it, ostensibly insinuating that even though he'd lose, he'd make sure the Ashen Claws would lose their chapter master as well, forcing Nev to withdraw. Okay, let's talk about the lore reasons as to why I think the Ashen Claws are not only the worst Renegade chapter, but one of the worst conceived chapters in all of 40k. Do understand that this is predominantly a dissection of Robbie McNiven's depiction of the Ashen Claws in Outer Dark, and not actually a criticism of their Horus Heresy-era lore. It's my belief that their Horus Heresy-era lore is actually pretty dope. I really like it, I think it's cool. The following is also where not just having a deep knowledge of 40k will come in handy, but also having understood the context surrounding all of the other Renegades that we've talked about up until this point, and as well the Renegade chapter that we'll discuss after in the best section. So I'm going to split this up into 3 segments: the Ghoul Stars, the Ashen Claws Empire, and the Imperium of Man/Inquisition. The Ghoul Stars. Outer Dark's representation of the Ghoul Stars runs almost completely contrary to every other depiction we see in the lore. Now, whilst Outer Dark is happy to tell you that the Ghoul Stars are a treacherous place that eats Space Marine chapters for breakfast, it doesn't show it as such, and instead we're kinda treated to a waiting game of the Xenos will get here eventually, Though when they do eventually arrive, we are actually treated to one of Robbie McNiven's better skills as a writer, and that would be his ability to depict 40k's specific brand of violence. We know from Imperial Armor Volume 9, Badab War Part 1, as well as Imperial Armor Apocalypse 2, the 5th Ed Space Marine Codex, and the Black Templars 9th Ed Codex, that the Ghoul Stars are simply not to be f***ed with for a massive variety of reasons. At least a dozen Space Marine chapters have entered the Ghoul Stars and never returned. The Black Templars have launched entire crusades into the Ghoul Stars and made it no safer. The Karkarodons themselves are one of the few chapters that has a recurring familiarity with the Ghoul Stars, thus is meant to know how to navigate and survive its horrors, yet Outer Dark presents the Karkarodons as kind of clueless as to how to deal with the Ghoul Stars for much of the book. It's even one of the few places in the galaxy that's deemed so dangerous by the Ordo Xenos that a Deathwatch Watch Fortress has been placed at its borders. The Deathwatch, the special ops of the Space Marines, the best of the best of the best, are placed on standby in case it stirs. In a galaxy defined by its endless horrors, the Ghoul Stars are meant to stand apart as this ultimate hell pit, second only to marching directly into the Great Rift itself. And Outer Dark sadly presents it as just another place. Now, you might be wondering, how does this tie into the Ashen Claws? Well, the Ashen Claws and their empire. Robbie McNiven's Outer Dark is keen to make sure that you know that the Ashen Claws have established an empire within the Ghoul Stars, and that this empire has stood for the best part of the last 10,000 years. The truth is that the Ashen Claws are renegades, not empire builders. Even the greatest Space Marine protectorates, save Ultramar, cannot be considered empires. Whilst at the closing of the Horus Heresy, the Ashen Claws numbered enough Marines to constitute 4 to 6 whole chapters. They exist in an area of space defined by not only its sheer danger, but its isolation. Outer Dark prompts this notion that on rare occasions, the Ashen Claws and the Karkarodons trade with one another for mutual benefit. But the Karkarodons themselves are space scavengers, often fielding mismatched armors and even Mark V heresy armor, which, as you likely know, whilst visually quite striking, is functionally the worst mark of armor the Space Marines can use, created and used out of desperation and a lack of better resources. The notion that the Karkarodons or anything that could possibly survive entering the Ghoul Stars has helped prop up an anti-imperial independent empire reliant on piracy and slave trading stretches credulity to an extent that can't really be explained away by the old 40k is just wacky like that excuse. Understandably, entering the Ghoul Stars with Legion-era equipment and 4,000 to 6,000 Marines is quite the force, but it's difficult to believe that so many Marines could survive, reproduce, and maintain said empire when more than double that number of Space Marines, largely better equipped with 10 millennia of consistent Imperial support, have simply died by entering the Ghoul Stars. The truth is that the Ashen Claws empire only maintains its plausibility as long as you, the reader, elect to apply no deeper than a surface level of thought about its origins or upkeep. The rest of the Imperium and the Inquisition. Whilst the Ashen Claws are technically a chapter, they're also not. Unlike other official extra-founding groups of Space Marines like the Sons of Medusa or Steel Confessors, the Ashen Claws were never ratified by any Imperial body. Of course, this makes sense. They are renegades after all, the original Black Shield warband, the blood of Corvus Corax and the doctrine of Horus Lupercal. Though, like every Space Marine renegade chapter we've discussed in this video so far, the Imperium of Man demands their destruction. Or does it? McNiven's Outer Dark seemingly proposes that the Ashen Claws are the only renegade Space Marines in all of 40k that the Imperium does not actively seek to destroy, which is weird. It's so weird, in fact, that Outer Dark almost meta-contextually talks about this. The Ashen Claws are on edge with the Karkarodons, largely because they believe that one day the Imperium of Man will simply sign their death warrants and have them expunged entirely. The problem with this, though, is McNiven never actually offers any explanation as to why the Imperium hasn't done away with them already. They've had 10 millennia to do it after all, and they've killed far more for far less. You could, of course, state that the dangers of the Ghoul Stars infer that such an extermination would be untenable, but then logically one would have to assume that the Ashen Claws Empire's existence would be equally, if not more, untenable. Another defense could instead be the notion that the Imperium simply doesn't think their existence constitutes the effort. But once again, if you've not skipped right to this section of the video, you know that's not true. The Imperium of Man and the Inquisition are levels of prejudice, the likes of which is incomprehensible to most modern-day individuals. Vengeance, brutality, hatred, these are not just ideas to the Imperium of Man, but philosophies that consistently define not just human culture, but imperial military action. The Inquisition has brought destruction down upon far larger, sentient, organized bodies in the galaxy for far less. Sadly, Outer Dark's proposed version of the Ashen Claws relies overwhelmingly on this notion that we as readers simply won't think about how the Imperium of Man or the Inquisition deals with renegades, or independent human bodies that pay no homage to the God Emperor or the Tithe Rolls. And of course, we can't talk about how the Imperium interacts with the Ashen Claws without acknowledging the various instances of the Ashen Claws sacking Imperial supplies, killing loyalists, and even as recently as Outer Dark, threatening to kill the Carcharodons. Fundamentally, much like the Ashen Claws' empire, or their existence within the Ghoul Stars, the Ashen Claws' relationship with the Imperium of Man, much like all their lore in this era, requires the suspension of critical thought, and falls apart under the slightest scrutiny. This is something unique to the Ashen Claws as renegades. As we've established with all of the others on this list, all other renegade chapters in the Imperium, the galaxy, and the lore are largely consistent and believable. Some like to think of renegade space marines as the Shadow the Hedgehogs of the Astartes. If so, then the Ashen Claws are, without a doubt, the My OC do not steal hedgehogs of the Astartes. I will return to the Ashen Claws at the end of the video. I have a few thoughts that I don't think make a whole lot of sense to include here that I want to talk about, so we will visit those. And yes, one of them is how to fix the Ashen Claws, because you could actually fix them with 2 throwaway sentences and an index, but we'll come back to that at the end of the video. Right, that being said, let us move on to the best. If you've been around Warhammer 40k for a while, this next Space Marine chapter is likely the first chapter that you'll think of when you hear the phrase Renegade Space Marines. They are the Renegade Space Marine chapter with by far the most lore, with representation in over a dozen Space Marine novels and indexes, which contains their whole omnibus. These renegades actually manage to fulfill, in various degrees, all 3 of our fate criterions: falling to chaos, becoming extinct, and finding redemption. I am, of course, talking about none other than the Soul Drinkers chapter. The Soul Drinkers' history is so long and well documented that I don't think it's a stretch to say they've got more characterization than some of the first founding chapters, in the 40k era at least. Largely depicted by the author Ben Counter, who between 2002 and 2020 wrote 12 Soul Drinkers novels and novellas. The first 2, Soul Drinker and Bleeding Chalice, are a great read, and will tell you more about Renegade Space Marine chapters, how they operate, what they have to deal with, and of course provide context on how to homebrew one if you so choose. The Soul Drinker's story is the definitive Renegade story, and whilst the later books do indeed get quite wacky, they succeeded at putting renegades as a subtype of Astartes separate from Loyalist or Chaos on the map. I'm not going to recount every tiny detail of their story, mostly for 2 reasons. 1, because there's so many that we'd be here all day, and 2, because I would sincerely hate to deprive you all of the various nuanced moments present in their various novels and stories. But I will still try to make sure you can come away from this video confident that you know their story, which begins at the closing of the Horus Heresy. As per the novel Soul Drinker, the Primarch Rogol Dawn creating his second founding successor chapters from the Brothers of the Imperial Fists Legion, the Black Templars, the Crimson Fists, the Excoriators, the Fists Exemplar, and the Soul Drinkers. Also potentially the Executioners and some others as well, but that's not confirmed for certain. All of the original successors of Dawn received various gifts, weapons, and trinkets, etc. from the Imperial Fists Legion and Dawn himself. The original Soul Drinkers from 10,000 years ago were presented with an item from Rogol Dawn as well. An item that likely led to their namesake, the Soul Spear. The Soul Spear was a great archaeotech device that was allegedly used by Dawn himself, though no Horus Heresy novels actually depict this. That said, the Soul Spear was a great weapon, capable of unleashing great arcane blasts amongst other things. This relic, the most treasured relic of the chapter, would be pivotal in the Soul Drinker's excommunication, corruption, and death. Though before we get to that, we must first jump to mid-M32, during the War of the Beast, whereupon the Imperium of Man was beset by the greatest green-skinned threat ever since the Emperor himself took to Ulanor. As true Sons of Dawn, the Soul Drinkers alongside their brother chapters made haste to Terra, enacting the Last Wall Protocol. A secret decree penned by Rogel Dawn himself, spread covertly amongst all of the chapter masters of the various Imperial Fist successor chapters, to ostensibly reform as a legion on Terra herself, should the throne world face an existential threat. Of course, the enacting of the Last Wall Protocol was far from perfect. It didn't take long after the creation of the Codex Astartes for the Space Marine chapters to take a great deal of pride in their newfound independence. And no Space Marine wants to have their chapter condemned by the High Lords or Inquisition in the process of abandoning that independence, even temporarily. However, the Sons of Dawn did unite, and the Soul Drinkers did their part to fight off the Orkoid threat. Fast forward to M40, some 1,000 years before the present setting, the Soul Spear relic was lost, alongside the Soul Drinker's flagship and an unknown number of the chapter's marines in the warp. As you might expect, this was a huge blow to the chapter, but like all good Astartes, they kept on. Fast forward to the end of M41, the Soul Drinkers led by the venerable commander Kion were sent to destroy anti-Imperial forces on the world of Laconia. The chapter also learned that the Soul Spear was present on Laconia. Thus, a mission would be undertaken to reclaim their greatest relic. 3 whole companies of Soul Drinkers fought to take the orbital defense station above Laconia, where the relic was being held. Fighting their way to their objective, the Soul Spear was almost in their hands when, seemingly out of nowhere, military forces of the Mechanicus would arrive and take the Soul Spear for themselves. Instead of engaging in battle there and then aboard the station, the Admech forces quickly escaped. The Soul Drinkers quickly made the station war-ready and demanded the Adeptus Mechanicus forces present to surrender the Soul Spear. The Soul Drinkers were ready to go to war for this vessel of their heritage. Unfortunately, the Mechanicus forces had already sent the Soul Spear off on another vessel to be sent to a nearby Forge World. At the same time, the Admech would reveal a great siege weapon aboard their vessel and would call the Soul Drinkers bluff. The Soul Drinkers, however, were not bluffing. Thus, a battle between the two forces would ensue, resulting in the destruction of not just the orbital platform, but several thousand Admech personnel. Commander Kion would also meet his end during this fighting, but not before declaring the librarian Sarpedon would lead the 3-company task force of Soul Drinkers in his stead. This slaughter of Admech forces would lead the Soul Drinkers chapter to be officially declared excommunicate traitoris. As far as the Administratum, Inquisition, and wider Imperium of Man was concerned, the Soul Drinkers had been sent to pacify criminals on a world of middling importance, and instead destroyed a vital space station and ended thousands of Admech's souls. The truth is that even if the Imperium knew the Soul Drinkers were seeking a relic that was by right theirs, the Imperium simply would not care. Infighting on this scale requires blame, and the Admech are far more important than one paltry Space Marine chapter. Thus, the Soul Drinkers would officially be designated as Renegades. Elsewhere in the galaxy, the main force of Soul Drinkers, led by Chapter Master Gorgolian, would discover that they too were now Renegades. Gorgolian would ready his men to make for Sarpedon's task force, feeling as though it was his right and his duty to condemn his brothers before the Imperium would kill them all. For almost half a year, Sarpedon's task force would do battle with a variety of local Imperial forces in a highly dense asteroid region of the galaxy, known as the Cerebian Field. Sarpedon and his 300 men, in a fun parallel to a certain historical event, would use the asteroids to bottleneck and isolate the Imperial forces, creating what seemed like a stalemate. A stalemate that would come to an end with the intervention of the Ordo Hereticus Inquisitor, Soras. Via an emissary in the form of his acolytes, Soras would make a one-time offer to Sarpedon: surrender and submit to the unforgiving Inquisition. In exchange, the larger Soul Drinkers chapter would not face the judgment of excommunicate traitoris. Only Sarpedon and his 300 men would be put down. Sarpedon, however, would not concede. He and his men felt justified in their actions. The Soul Spear, after all, was their birthright. Why would they just lay down and die? They'd already shown their willingness to fight and die for the Soul Spear. As far as Sarpedon was concerned, the stakes hadn't changed. Sarpedon sent Soras' emissary back in a body bag. Enraged by this, Soras demanded his forces enter en masse to destroy Sarpedon. However, much to the Inquisitor's dismay, the rest of the Soul Drinkers chapter arrived, just in time to extract Sarpedon and his forces. Unable to complete his charge, the Inquisitor would settle for the mass eradication of all Imperial forces who had come into contact with Sarpedon and his Soul Drinkers since their mission on Laconia. It's noted in Bleeding Chalice that only a handful of menials and inconsequential individuals would survive the Inquisitor's purges. Now the Soul Drinkers were reunited proper, Chapter Master Gorgolian would make Sarpedon pay for the crime of damning the chapter. In a not totally uncommon Space Marine fashion, Sarpedon would face trial by combat, with Gorgolian himself executing the charge. Now, you might be thinking that this should be no problem. After all, Sarpedon is a librarian and Gorgolian is just a Space Marine. However, Gorgolian was a Space Marine hero. Watching this video, you may not be aware, but in the earlier days of Warhammer 40k, when its gothic Gregorian monk thematics was still the defining feature of the setting, long before Primaris was even conceived, to be a Space Marine hero was to be a demigod. Space Marine heroes of that era would complete feats that would make even modern-day custodians shudder. When people referred to Space Marine heroes, they didn't just mean named characters, they meant gods of war. Chapter Master Gorgolian was one such Space Marine. He wore ornate, bespoke Artificer power armor, and his weapon of choice was a mighty relic power fist, even more ornate than his armor. Sarpedon didn't stand a chance, even with his psychic powers. The fight was, for the most part, extremely one-sided. However, just before Gorgolian was about to fold Sarpedon into a pretzel, something most terrible would occur. Sarpedon's psychic powers were amplified by a yet unknown source. Not only that, but his lower body would quickly mutate, turning the librarian into some kind of mutant crab-like arachnid from the waist down. Using his newfound might, Sarpedon would rip Gorgolian in two with frightening ease, and would go on to seize control of the chapter whole. Sarpedon's power was seemingly granted to the Space Marine by an unknown aspect of the Emperor himself, or so Sarpedon thought. Unbeknownst to the new chapter master, his power was actually from a great and terrible demon prince of Tzeentch, known as Abraxas. According to the End and the Death Part 1, alongside Be'lakor, Dracnian, Kugath, Skarbrand, Epidemius, and a veritable legion of demons and named demon princes, Abraxas was named personally as one who would join in the final assault during the Siege of Terra 10,000 years ago. Though, like many of those named demons, Abraxas' specific actions during the ultimate conflict of the Horus Heresy are not known. But this demon prince of Tzeentch was there. There's no timeline confirmed as to when Abraxas takes a personal interest in Sarpedon, but I suspect it was sometime before the events of the Soul Drinker book. As you might expect with Sarpedon's new, spider-like visage, much of the chapter was not particularly eager to follow him. Luckily for Sarpedon, much of the chapter's command staff were already either loyal to him or knew that without his leadership, the chapter's odds of surviving in an Imperium that wanted them dead would go from low to zero. Still, there was a purge that lasted a number of months, during which those loyal to Sarpedon would eradicate many of their brothers who were not loyal. With much of their infrastructure now crippled, the chapter took refuge within a space hulk known as the Broken Back. The voice of the Emperor living in Sarpedon's mind would see the Soul Drinkers do war with the forces of Nurgle, specifically a demon prince known as Vameth. When the Soul Drinkers defeated this demon prince and his forces, the voice in Sarpedon's mind would reveal its true form. Abraxas showed himself. It was pleased that the Soul Drinkers had done away with a rival demon prince of another chaos god. It was proud of the Soul Drinkers. It was proud of Sarpedon. It wanted to officiate their union, to turn the Soul Drinkers into proper Chaos Space Marines, to make them its Chaos Warband under Sarpedon. As a reward for their efforts, Abraxas returned the Soul Spear to Sarpedon right there and then. However, just like the offer that Inquisitor Suras made to Sarpedon, he would refuse Abraxas. The Soul Drinkers would then go on to kill Abraxas' minions, while Sarpedon himself seemingly slew the Demon Prince of Tzeentch with the Soul Spear. This might all seem like the good end to a story, a chapter now rid of the monkey on its back. Unfortunately for the Soul Drinkers, it would only get worse from here. You see, the Soul Drinkers had long since began to mutate. They were seemingly undergoing a sort of flesh change. It wasn't just Sarpedon who was a half-chaos spawn monster. Many Marines were fusing with their armor and weapons or growing claws and horns. Some Marines were rendered entirely inoperable and needed to be put down for the sake of themselves and those around them. Whether the chapter wanted it or not, they were being overtaken by chaos. Sarpedon's priority now was to find a way to rid his chapter of this Tzeentchian flesh change. A heretic homunculus dubbed the Tesseract, creating what it had belligerently dubbed its own little empire, was currently spreading its tendrils out across several worlds. It had even managed to absorb a Forge world, a Hive world, and more importantly, the world of Stratix Liminae, a world where Zarpedon once fought long before his chapter found itself a dying leper. Upon Stratix, Zarpedon recalled a laboratory and evidence of genetic experimentation. The Soul Drinkers attempted to track down surviving Mechanicus personnel from Stratix on several worlds controlled by Tesseract, while evading a new Imperial task force led by an Inquisitor Thaddeus. After gathering the information they needed, they made their way to Stratix Liminae itself. Tesseract intervened directly, breaking apart its flagship in orbit and sending debris and its undead followers down onto the Soul Drinkers. Zarpedon incapacitated Tesseract long enough for Thaddeus to shoot him, and then destroyed Tesseract's soul, bringing its burgeoning mini-empire to an abrupt end. After the defeat of the heretic Tesseract, the Soul Drinkers were forced to abandon Stratix, leaving behind a number of assault squads under Sergeant Telos. Who was already teetering on the brink of Cornate fury, Telos fully succumbed to the Blood God's embrace, dragging his warriors into open heresy. Chapter Master Zarpedon swiftly discerned this corruption and pursued his fallen brother to Endymion 4, a world contested by the Imperial Guard and Crimson Fist against an alliance of Dark Eldar and Slaaneshi cults. When the Crimson Fists first encountered Telios' Chaos Space Marines in the capsule of Gravenhold, they thought the entire Soul Drinkers chapter was complicit. They summoned reinforcements from Rindsworld with orders to destroy the chapter and claim Zarpedon's head. Upon arriving, Zarpedon's forces infiltrated the world by hijacking Imperial Navy landers, provoking open war with the Crimson Fists. A savage engagement saw the Soul Drinkers need to withdraw. The Dark Eldar's slave army stalled pursuit as the Soul Drinkers retreated beneath the city, where Zarpedon accepted a less than easy alliance with the Xenos. Dividing his forces to occupy the Imperial Guard, Zarpedon sent scouts to hunt Telos. The traitor was found slaughtering guardsmen, and after Chaplain Ictinus held him at bay, Zarpedon cast Telos down by collapsing a bridge on top of him. Yet, the Dark Eldar's greater design neared fruition. A hidden legion of mutated slaves was coming, intending to transform Endymion 4 into a new hell realm like Comora. In a final stroke of cunning, the Soul Drinkers manipulated the Crimson Fists into assaulting the Dark Eldar stronghold, annihilating the Xenos and thwarting their plan. Though their plan was broken, the Warp's taint had already seeped deep into the world. With no hope of redemption, Endymion 4 was consigned to Exterminatus. Some time after these events, Zarpedon would find himself and a number of his brothers on a world battling an Orc horde, down there at the request of the chapter's most senior chaplain to help defend a vulnerable citizenry. However, back aboard the Broken Back, an upstart sergeant named Jimenez would seize control of the Space Hulk. Jimenez, unlike Zarpedon, had entirely forsaken the Imperium and the Emperor, and wanted to head right for Terra in a last-ditch effort to kill the Emperor of Mankind. As this was happening, Inquisitor Thaddeus would find himself commandeering the Howling Griffins chapter, though their cooperation was far from rock steady. So unsteady, in fact, that when the Howling Griffins began their attack on the Soul Drinkers down upon the planet, the Inquisitor Thaddeus was actually killed by a Howling Griffin librarian, Mechaino, for a particularly extreme indiscretion the Inquisitor visited upon the chapter. Stranded on the planet, Zarpedon and his men ostensibly surrendered to Jimenez, who was briefly declared chapter master of the Soul Drinkers. Zarpedon returned to the Broken Back via shuttle sent at Jimenez's convenience, just in time to help repel the Howling Griffin's warning actions. In a psychic duel, Zarpedon fought the librarian Mechaino of the Howling Griffins. So powerful was Mechaino that he proved to be Zarpedon's match, at least in terms of psychic martial power. Jimenez used the distraction of the psychic duel to kill Mechaino whilst he was preoccupied. Now warp-charged, Jimenez would wield both the Soul Spear and the dead Howling Griffin's Force Axe in a battle against Zarpedon. Thanks to Zarpedon's monstrous form gifted by Abraxas, he was just barely able to kill the upstart Jimenez and take back his chapter. As time went on, the chapter became continuously weaker, pursued not just by the Inquisition, but by forces of the Adeptus Mechanicus as well, who had a plethora of reasons to want the Soul Drinkers dead or in custody. This pursuit culminates in a battle upon a Necron tomb world, of which the chapter barely escapes and is reduced even further by attacks from the Xenos and the Imperium. It's safe to say at this point that the Soul Drinkers are barely a shell of who they were, even whilst they were being manipulated by Abraxas. Sadly, the weakened Space Marines are set upon by the Imperial Fists themselves. Answering calls from the Adeptus Mechanicus, first Captain Darnath Lysander of the Fists alongside 20 Terminators of the First Company meet Zarpedon, taking the chapter into custody. After their capture, the surviving Soul Drinkers were tried aboard the Phalanx before a conclave of Imperial Fist successors and other Imperial authorities, some being from other chapters. During the proceedings, the Angels Sanguine revealed that examination of the chapter's gene seed proved that they were not descended from Rogel Dawn at all, a revelation that shook the chapter to its very core. It was also uncovered that Athos, an ancient Soul Drinkers dreadnought that existed some 5,000 years ago, was still alive, and had for thousands of years been plotting the chapter's path to rebellion, manipulating important figures within the chapter for millennia. Freed aboard the Phalanx by a cult he had planted centuries before, Athos unleashed the demon Abraxas through the Predator's Eye warp gate, intending to plunge the Imperium into ruin. Though the remaining Soul Drinkers chaplains, now heavily corrupted, sided with Athos, most of the remaining Soul Drinkers rejected his treachery and fought alongside the Imperial Fist to defeat Abraxas and seal the warp gate. In the final battle, Sarpedon destroyed Athos' dreadnought and took his hollow self captive, but nearly all the chapter perished. In the end, Sarpedon and less than a squad's worth of his remaining brothers entered the warp gate, dragging the captive Athos with them. The Soul Drinkers were never seen again. Acknowledging their final loyalty, the Imperial Fists honored the fallen on the Phalanx, though the Inquisition later suppressed much of their history to bury the chapter's troubling legacy. There is a Primaris Space Marine chapter born of the Ultima founding known as the Soul Drinkers. In all likelihood, a chapter whose creation was prompted by those noble Imperial Fists who saw the honor of their lost brethren, demanding their honor not go to waste. I won't spoil that story for you, however. The novella Traitor by Deed that covers that story is well worth your attention. For now, let's just say the Inquisition isn't done with the Soul Drinkers. Before I get into the ending of this video, there is one thing about the Soul Drinkers chapter I would like to talk about. You see, the Soul Drinkers and the readers all spent so much time believing the chapter are or were sons of Rogel Dawn, and for good reason too. However, the final book in the original Soul Drinkers series destroys the idea that they're sons of Dawn, and were never actually given the answer as to who their gene father is. However, I'd like to pose a suggestion that a number of long-time Soul Drinkers fans have already suggested. I think the Primarch of the Soul Drinkers chapter is none other than Magnus the Red. Not only is the chapter plagued by a terrible flesh change, reminiscent of the same flesh change the Thousand Sons Legion suffered 10,000 years ago, but that flesh change is prompted by an ancient demon prince of Tzeentch. Now, I know this might seem a bit flimsy, certainly very convenient. However, I'd like to pose one more bit of potentially circumstantial evidence. In 2023, Games Workshop released the campaign book for Horus Heresy 2nd edition, called The Siege of Chthoniya, which centered around the Imperial Fists and Sons of Horus warring over the homeworld of Horus Lupercal. You see, during that war, for some relatively complex reasons I won't go into here, the 5th Fellowship of the Thousand Sons Legion was present on Chthoniya. The 5th Fellowship was, at the time, numbered around 3,000 Marines, and they had forsaken Magnus the Red and the larger Legion. Even after the events of Prospero, which they had largely escaped, they were still loyal to the Emperor of Mankind. The 5th Fellowship even scrubbed their armor of any and all Prosperine heraldry, and redonned their gear with the same colors and iconography of their legion in the days before its union with Magnus. Anyways, to make a long story short, after the Battle for Chthoniya ended, the Imperial Fists present, led by Lord Castellan Evander Garius, who has his own savage model by the way, would see the 5th Fellowship of the Thousand Sons as worthy brothers, and ostensibly absorbed the remaining Marines who survived the conflict into the Imperial Fists Legion. I would surmise that it was these Marines who survived Chthoniya, these loyalist Thousand Sons, who would go on to become the Soul Drinkers chapter, loyal to Rogel Dawn and the Imperium of Man. Of course, this theory has more than a few faults, mind you, but it's certainly got some legs, even if there are a handful of blanks that need filling in. And that is the tier list. This is, of course, as any good tier list should be, entirely subjective. Putting this together was an absolutely Goliath effort, and as I'm writing this now, I'm sat in front of a 45-page Microsoft Word document with almost 22,000 words. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching, especially those of you who stuck around for the end. I'm going to go off script for a few minutes now, just to talk about the Red Corsairs, the Fallen, the Ashen Claws, and the Subjugators chapter, so stick around if you want a few extra thoughts. Thanks all for watching. Oh, we're off script. No script. This recording in front of me is like
2 hours and 55 minutes long. I'm going to try and condense it down, get rid of a lot of the breathing and dead space, and try and bring it around about 2.5 hours, maybe a bit less, maybe a bit more. We'll have to wait and see. So, welcome to the end of the video. I wanted to go off script and I wanted to talk about a few things here related to the Renegades. 4 things in particular. I want to talk about the Red Corsairs, I want to talk about the Fallen, I want to talk about the Subjugators, and I want to talk about the Ashen Claws. So, Red Corsairs real quick. This is more of a meta thing I just wanted to comment on. With the revival of the Red Corsairs, with the new model lines GW's been chucking out, it has kind of reignited that the term Renegade is synonymous with Chaos Space Marines, as opposed to Space Marines that are neither Loyalist or Chaos affiliated. This has led to some confusing conversations in the Discord, and I suspect in other people's Discords and communities as well. But just to clarify, make no mistake, the Red Corsairs are Chaos Space Marines, right? They are referred to as Renegades in the way that the word Renegade, the term Renegade, is synonymous with the term Chaos Space Marine in 40k lore. But if you enter a 40k homebrewing space, for example, you'll understand that Renegades and Chaos Space Marines are actually quite different. You know, in homebrewing spaces, Renegades are like the chapters we've listed in this video, and chapters like the Red Corsairs would just be a Chaos Space Marine warband. Yeah? Whether you're born from one of the traitor legions, or born from a chapter that has turned traitor, you are still a Chaos Space Marine. Huron Blackheart himself, he has made a pact with the Dark Gods that is as Chaos Space Marine as it gets. Yeah. It is cool though. I do think it is cool though how a lot of his Warband's models, a lot of the Red Corsair models are kind of like, oh, we're just starting to be a little bit chaosy, but we look like we could still be loyalist. But we're just starting to get some of that taint going on, you know, which is very cool. Just remember, though, that like when you're playing your Red Corsairs, you can take Chaos Space Marine Legionaries, you can take Venom Crawlers, you can take Demons and Demon Princes and whatever, right? So, like, definitely Chaos Space Marines. But yeah, it's just fun. I just wanted to comment on the sort of meta-contextual kind of existence of the term Renegade and its separate uses in the community. Interesting stuff. Next, I want to talk about the Fallen. Someone asked me, where am I putting the Fallen on this tier list? The Fallen, 99 times out of 100, end up being Chaos Space Marines in novel and book appearances. We've got those new I say new, they're not new anymore. We've got the Inner Circle Companions, who are rumored but not confirmed to be redeemed or risen. And we've got the handful of dudes. We've got the 5 or 6 fellas who the Lion met in Son of the Forest. And those guys were technically renegades. It was a 5-man band of renegades. I don't know where I'd put them on the list. I think we could do with like a novel or a short story of some Fallen who were actual renegades, not Chaos Space Marines. I think that would go a long, long way. I'd really like that. If one exists and I've just somehow like managed to avoid it this whole time, then let me know. But some renegades who are like loyal to mankind, hate chaos, but we were there at the destruction of Caliban. That would be really cool. I'd really like that. I'd love to read that. It would also now's the best time to release that book, by the way, if they did that. Now is the best time to add some context to the Risen. To add some context to the Lion forgiving his sons. You know, now's the best time for that. Where would I put them on the tier list? If that was to happen, I don't know. It depends how it's written. As you can tell, a lot of this tier list really comes down to the effort that was put into depicting these guys, the consistencies put into depicting them. You know, Ashen Claws are at the bottom because they're super inconsistent with everything else. They kind of don't make a lot of sense. And why would they make a lot of sense? They are mentioned in like only a small portion of a book in which they're not even the main characters, so it's like, why would they? We'll come to the Ashen Claws in a sec. I want to talk really quickly before that about the Subjugators chapter. The Subjugators should have been on this list because they didn't turn to Chaos, and they were never technically declared Renegades. I mean, they kind of were. So basically what happened, I'm paraphrasing here, right? I should have put them on the list. I didn't. They're the outlier. If there's another outlier, let me know. But the Subjugators chapter, to make a long story short, had like a portion of their company face off against a bunch of mind-controlling Xenos, and their space marine biology was able to fend off these aliens. And then it turned out, oh wait a minute, hold up, a couple of them weren't. And so there's 20 subjugator marines who've basically gone renegade and are still at large in the galaxy whilst being possessed by Xenos. That is all we know about them. If I had to put them, I'd have put them in D tier or C tier. I can't see me have put them higher than that. But thank you, brother Cambrius, in the Discord for letting me know. I'd forgotten that one, so that's very good. Finally, fixing the Ashen Claws. I wanted to talk about the Ashen Claws, because here's the thing. The Ashen Claws might be in a place where I'm prepared to point the finger at them and be like, this doesn't make any sense. But here's the thing. You could fix the Ashen Claws with 2 or 3 sentences in an index somewhere. You could make them work really, really easily. One of the things, the first thing you could do, and this is the first thing you could do, have them in an index somewhere, is actually talk about how weak they are. Depict them not as this depict their chapter strength and this quote-unquote empire as largely propagandizing, as this kind of thing that they perpetrate themselves within the Ghoul Stars to kind of make people think twice about fighting them. It makes this idea, it means that all of the talk of their empire and stuff in Outer Dark is still legit. It still makes sense to be there. It's just as we as the audience know on a meta level that they're just bluffing. That actually, turns out, spending 10,000 years in the Ghoul Stars is really bad. And it sucks. And it doesn't leave you with a lot. I think that's a good angle to take to start off there. I don't think that's enough, though. I still think it's kind of unbelievable that they would be out there for so long, even with that. So I think the next thing that's probably worth doing is having them, similar to a bunch of the Renegades we spoke about in this tier list, having them be afflicted by chaos in some degree. Now, we know that the Ashen Claws say they hate chaos, or at least Nev says he hates chaos, right? He hates chaos, he hates the Imperium, he hates all of it. But there's no reason to say why there can't be some kind of internal schism within the Ashen Claws. There's no reason to say why members or chunks, sways of the Ashen Claws haven't fallen to chaos. I mean, there's no one out there to shield their souls. It's one of the big things about the different Space Marines in 40k versus Space Marines in 30k is that Space Marines in 40k, through indoctrination, have their souls kind of fortified against chaos, right? And the Ashen Claws have been without that for 10,000 years. So I think a really good angle would be to create some level of internal strife in the chapter, so that it's not like, hey, we're this perfect empire, everything's cool here, we rule the Ghoul Stars, even though no one else can enter the Ghoul Stars without being turned inside out. You know what I mean? I think the other thing as well that I would like to see, a last little thing, and this is more of a criticism of Outer Dark in general than it is about the Ashen Claws, is this idea that the Carcharodons are not really under the scrutiny of the Inquisition at all, when they should be. The idea that the Carcharodons are going around giving stuff to an anti-imperial force, and that the Ordo Astartes is just somehow not aware of this, is mind-boggling to me. We see this a lot when you deal with people's homebrews and you read a lot of homebrews. You see it a lot. One of the most common things you'll see when a Space Marine chapter does something that's kind of crazy is one of the things that homebrewers will do is they'll just say, yes, they've managed to keep it a secret from the Inquisition. Yes, the Inquisition doesn't know about this. Or God forbid you get the old, but they do it because the Inquisition wants them to. And it's like, man, you don't know. The Inquisition ain't like that, man. The Inquisition wants nothing to do with any of that. So it's a real interesting one. So I think putting the Carcharodons under a level of inquisitorial scrutiny would make a lot of what happens in Outer Dark feel more believable, I think. Quick address. Lastly, I want to say that Robbie McNiven is not a bad writer. I dog on the Ashen Claws a lot on streams in the podcast, and so people have got this impression that I hate Robbie McNiven. I make jokes. McNiven is great at writing violence. 40k's specific brand of hyper-violence, he knows how to do, right? We got with this whole vision of Tybros the Red Wake, tearing through corridors of Termagants and Hormagaunts and other Tyranids and stuff. Robbie McNiven is the reason we have that visage of Tybros, right? So I'm not ambivalent to his writing skills. I just think that when he went to do Outer Dark, he was like, I really want a way to
depict the Carcharodons as kind of on the edge, right? Kind of on the edge, a little bit out there. And I think he knew he wanted them to have an interaction with a extra Imperial force that wasn't really Imperial, but wasn't Chaos either, so like, Renegades are perfect, right? And we've got all these chapters of Renegades who are still at large, or at least were at large at the time that Outer Dark took place. And instead of going for any of those, or coming up with a new one, God, I loved it if he came up with a new one, he kind of went, oh, I know, we'll pluck some lore from the Horus Heresy and insert it into 40k, and it's like, it's so cheap. I love the Horus Heresy, and I love 40k, but I love the differences. I love that they're separate. I love that Horus Heresy is this unfathomable age of myth to those who exist in 40k. You know, this is actually a large part of the thinking why so many people in 2016 and 2017 were, about 10 years ago now, were so annoyed that Rabute Gilliman had come back, right? Because GW had basically made the decision, hey, the era of myth is over. It's like, oh no, but that was one of the coolest things. You know, I understand GW wasn't in a good financial spot at the time and needed to make some huge changes to avoid their own demise, but still, it's a bummer. It's a bummer. But yeah, no, I think the Carcharodons, they're cool. I think we just need to be a bit more scrutinous about them, and I hope somewhere in an index we get a little thing that makes the Ashen Claws a little bit more believable. I think the final thing I want to say, the reason why I'm so vitriolic about the Ashen Claws, is because I love Renegades. And I'm not going to pretend this isn't an ego thing. It sounds like an ego thing, it's because it is. I love Renegades, big time. I love reading about them. I love talking about them. I love reading people's homebrew Renegades, right? I love all of it. I adore it. It's like my favorite thing. It really is. I one of the things I'm afraid to do is to homebrew Renegades, because I'm afraid I won't do them well enough. You know, I want to do them right. I want to do them real good. I want to do them and then be memorable. My friends will read them. My friends will like them, right? The reason why I'm so vitriolic towards the Ashen Claws that kind of connects to this is because the channel is so homebrew-centric, the Discord is so homebrew-centric, that the homebrew review is coming back, and the second channel, we're putting a lot of effort into it. Here's the thing. Every time someone in the Discord wants to do homebrew Renegades, they ignore all 20 Renegade chapters. All of them get ignored, and they say, oh, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to be inspired by the Ashen Claws. And it's like, oh no, the Ashen Claws are a tertiary element in one book in 40k. And that they pose a lot of problems in that book that don't make a lot of sense. I see this is me speaking my truth. I see the Ashen Claws in the same way I see that one armorless world eater punching through a custodian, right? It's like, oh wow, this happened. This also made no sense. It's a fun one. Anyways, yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about at the end. All I wanted to mention. I hope you all loved the video. I hope you all enjoyed the tier list. This was a huge, huge effort getting this done, by the way. Absolutely gargantuan, and I really enjoyed doing it. Hopefully, I will think about the Ashen Claws a little bit less going forwards, now that I've got this out of my system. Yeah. Thank you all so, so much for watching. And once again, a big thank you to Tacticus for sponsoring this video. Please, everybody, go download Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. Download and play now. Use the code ASTARTES10. The link is in the description, and the QR code is on the screen. Go and enjoy it. Go play it. Go enjoy some Leagues of SOTN. Get it all. All right, we'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.